My father texted me that no one cared about my little Navy job and warned me not to embarrass the family in front of a four-star general. It was a hilarious message to read while brushing the dust of a classified combat zone off my shoulder. But the real punchline dropped a few hours later. The second I walked into my sister's lavish wedding ceremony, 300 battle-hardened SEALs jumped to their feet in perfect unison. A commander roared Admiral on deck. The absolute silence that fell over my arrogant family was a moment I will savor for the rest of my life. I am Diana, 34 years old, and I have spent my entire life as the designated failure of my wealthy family. They wanted a corporate socialite. Instead, they got a commander in a classified military intelligence unit. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I had been awake for 30 straight hours. My bones ached from sitting in the back of a rattling military transport plane directly after concluding a high-stakes extraction operation in the Middle East. Hundreds of lives had been saved during that mission, but as I walked through the busy airport terminal, all I wanted was a hot shower and a simple ride to my sister's wedding weekend in Newport, Rhode Island. I pulled out my phone and typed a quick message to our family group chat. My flight just landed. Can someone pick me up from the airport? The response from my father, Richard, came less than a minute later. I stared at the glowing screen, letting the familiar sting of his words wash over me without changing my expression. No one cares about your Navy career, he wrote. Take an Uber. We are busy entertaining Donovan's family. Do not embarrass us today. I locked my phone and grabbed my faded olive drab duffel bag. There was no point in arguing or begging for basic familial decency. In Richard's eyes, success was only measured by profit margins, corporate acquisitions, and high society networking. My decision to serve my country instead of taking a desk job at his logistics empire was nothing more than a blue-collar failure to him, an embarrassing detour he loved to mock at every opportunity. I caught a rideshare to the ultra-luxurious resort overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The sweeping circular driveway was packed with imported sports cars and valets rushing to open doors for women in designer gowns and men in tailored suits. I stepped out of the unassuming sedan wearing my standard-issue combat fatigues. The fabric was still stiff with desert dust and dried sweat, but I had literally not had a single second to change since ensuring my team made it out of the extraction zone alive. I slung my heavy bag over my shoulder and walked up the pristine marble steps. I barely made it past the grand glass doors of the lobby when a hand clamped down hard on my arm. It was Brittany, my 30-year-old sister, and the undisputed golden child of our family. She looked me up and down, her perfectly contoured face twisting in absolute disgust. "Are you seriously wearing the clothes you mop boat decks with to my rehearsal weekend?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the nearby wealthy guests would not hear. "You look like a homeless person who wandered off the street." Before I could even respond, my mother, Patricia, swooped in from the lounge area. She did not ask about my flight. She did not ask if I was exhausted or hungry. Instead, she grabbed my other arm and physically shoved me behind a massive floral arrangement near the coat check, treating me like a dirty secret that needed to be hidden from polite society. "I told you 10 years ago to quit that grunt work and be your father's secretary," Patricia whispered harshly, her manicured fingers digging into my shoulder. "Now look at you. Brittany is marrying into Pentagon royalty tomorrow and you show up looking like a complete disgrace. You are going to ruin everything we have worked for." Brittany crossed her arms aggressively, flashing her massive diamond engagement ring. "Donovan's family is flawless, Diana. His father is a highly respected military leader. If they see my sister looking like a disgraced mechanic, the wedding is going to be a disaster. Just go hide in your room until you figure out how to look like a normal person." I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink away from their coordinated attack. A decade of tactical interrogations had taught me exactly how to handle hostile forces. I calmly brushed my mother's hand off my uniform and adjusted my collar, brushing a speck of desert sand from the fabric. "I can stand in the corner, Mom," I said smoothly, letting a sharp smile touch my lips. But I really hope Dad prepared his bid well. I hear the Pentagon is cracking down hard on defense contractors with shady financial records. The color drained from my mother's face for a fraction of a second before her anger flared again. She opened her mouth to snap at me, but a heavy hand slammed onto my shoulder from behind. I turned to see my father towering over me. His face was red with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching. He had clearly overheard my comment and did not like the implications. "What do you know about the Pentagon?" Richard growled, leaning in close so only I could hear the venom in his voice. "You are a glorified boat scrubber. Listen to me very carefully. Tonight, General Thomas Donovan's father is signing a $500 million logistics contract with my company. That contract will make us unstoppable." He pointed a sharp finger directly at my chest, his eyes filled with absolute contempt. "You will go change into something decent. You will sit at the very back of the dining room near the restrooms. You will not speak to the general. You will not speak to Donovan, and you will absolutely not let anyone from that family see that I have a total failure for a daughter. Do you understand me?" I stared at the finger inches from my nose. The manicured nail practically quivered with his rage. Richard was a man who lived and died by optics, and standing in the gilded lobby of a five-star Rhode Island resort, my dust-covered combat boots were a direct assault on his carefully curated illusion of perfection. Above us, massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over the polished marble floors, while a string quartet played a soft, classical melody in the background. It was a world of absolute, untouchable privilege. I did not flinch. I did not step back. After commanding classified operations under heavy enemy fire, the red-faced tantrums of a corporate logistics CEO felt entirely insignificant. "You know absolutely nothing about the Pentagon," Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper so the passing bellhops pushing brass luggage carts would not hear. He leaned closer, the scent of expensive scotch and sheer desperation radiating off him. "General Thomas is signing a $500 million defense contract with my company tonight. $500 million. It is the only thing that matters. You will keep your mouth shut, you will sit exactly where you are told, and you will not ruin this for me." I held his furious gaze without blinking. A $500 million contract. I knew exactly what contract he was talking about. My intelligence unit had been auditing his shipping manifests for the past 6 months. Richard thought he was securing a legacy, but he was actually walking blindfolded into a federal trap. I knew his supply chains were compromised. I knew he had been cutting corners on armored transports, putting active-duty soldiers at risk to pad his own profit margins. But this was not the time to show my hand. The tactical advantage always goes to the soldier who lets the enemy underestimate them. Before I could deliver a neutral response, a smooth, arrogant voice echoed behind my father. "Is there a problem here, Richard?" I shifted my gaze. Stepping out of the resort's private VIP lounge was Donovan. My new brother-in-law wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. He was 33, an aggressive finance executive who carried himself with the supreme entitlement of a man who had never been told no. He slid his arm around Brittany's waist, looking at me with a mixture of pity and intense amusement. Donovan smirked, his eyes trailing over my faded olive-drab uniform, lingering on the scuff marks coating my heavy tactical boots. "So this is the famous sister who could not cut it in the corporate world. Brittany warned me you were a bit rough around the edges, but I did not realize you would show up to our wedding weekend looking like you just crawled out of a muddy trench." Brittany leaned into Donovan's side, playing the embarrassed victim flawlessly. "I tried to tell her to dress nicely, Donovan. I really did. But Diana has always insisted on being difficult. She just wants attention because she is jealous of what we have built." Donovan chuckled, a rich, condescending sound that made my mother nod along in eager agreement. "It is all right, babe. We can be charitable today." He looked back at me, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Do not worry, Diana. I know working a blue-collar military job does not pay much. My dad is a 4-star general at the Pentagon. If you behave yourself this weekend and try not to embarrass us, maybe I can talk to him. I am sure he could pull some strings and get you a nice quiet job answering phones at the base. Or maybe working in the cafeteria serving hot meals. It would be a huge step up from swabbing boat decks, right? The sheer volume of their collective delusion was almost suffocating. My mother stood there nodding eagerly, practically glowing at Donovan's insulting charity. My father looked intensely relieved that his wealthy future son-in-law was putting me in my place. They genuinely believed I was a low-level enlisted grunt scrubbing rust off battleships. They had absolutely no idea that my security clearance was higher than the general they were currently groveling to impress. They had no idea that just yesterday I had ordered a fleet of Black Hawk helicopters to extract 40 stranded Navy SEALs from a highly volatile hot zone. I looked at Brittany's smug face, and the familiar heavy weight of my past pressed against my chest. I remembered the day I turned 18. I had received an acceptance letter to a top-tier university. I had worked tirelessly for years earning perfect grades while Brittany spent her time partying and wrecking expensive cars. But when I asked Richard for the college fund my grandparents had set aside for me, he simply laughed. He told me he had drained that entire account to buy Brittany a brand new Porsche because she needed to maintain her social status for networking. He told me to figure my own life out. So I did. I walked straight into a recruitment office and enlisted. I fought tooth and nail through the most brutal training programs the military had to offer. I earned my degrees in intelligence and tactical strategy while they sat in country clubs sipping champagne. They thought my uniform was a symbol of poverty. They did not understand it was a symbol of pure survival forged in fires they could never endure. I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to give them a polite, meaningless response that would end the conversation and allow me to find my room. But before I could speak, a heavy, rhythmic vibration pulsed against my ribs. Deep inside the breast pocket of my combat jacket, my heavily encrypted satellite phone came to life. This was not a standard civilian device. It was a secure line connected directly to the Department of Defense Command Center. I unvelcroed the tactical pocket and pulled out the thick, ruggedized device. My family stared at the bulky piece of technology with visible confusion. "What on earth is that ancient thing?" Brittany sneered, crossing her arms. "Could you not afford a normal smartphone? Did you buy that at a surplus store?" I ignored her entirely and glanced down at the glowing screen. A single highly classified text message flashed across the encrypted interface. Eagle 1. Location secured. The Vanguard is inbound. Awaiting your command. A cold, precise smile touched the corners of my mouth. The Vanguard was my elite honor guard, and they were already moving into position. The trap was meticulously set. The pieces were all firmly on the board. I locked the screen and slid the heavy phone back into my tactical pocket. I looked at Donovan, then at my father, letting my gaze sweep over their expensive, meaningless posturing. "Answering phones sounds like a fascinating career path, Donovan," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion but laced with an icy edge. "But I am afraid my schedule is entirely booked for the foreseeable future." "Excuse me." Without waiting for their permission or their inevitable outrage, I turned on my heel and walked straight past them toward the glass elevators. I did not look back. I did not need to. I could feel their furious, bewildered stares burning into my spine. They thought they had successfully put the family failure in her place. They had no idea that the real storm had not even begun to make landfall. My father texted me that no one cared about my little Navy job and warned me not to embarrass the family in front of a 4-star general. It was a hilarious message to read while brushing the dust of a classified combat zone off my shoulder. But the real punchline dropped a few hours later. The second I walked into my sister's lavish wedding ceremony, 300 battle-hardened SEALs jumped to their feet in perfect unison. A commander roared Admiral on deck. The absolute silence that fell over my arrogant family was a moment I will savor for the rest of my life. "My name is Diana. I am 34 years old, and I have spent my entire life as the designated failure of my wealthy family. They wanted a corporate socialite. Instead, they got a commander in a classified military intelligence unit. Before I continue this story, Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I had been awake for 30 straight hours. My bones ached from sitting in the back of a rattling military transport plane directly after concluding a high-stakes extraction operation in the Middle East. The roar of the aircraft engines still echoed in my ears as my boots hit the concrete of the civilian airport. Hundreds of lives had been saved during that mission. My tactical team executed a flawless recovery under the cover of darkness, pulling Allied operatives out of a hostile region right before the enemy forces closed in on our position. I had personally coordinated the satellite overwatch directing ground movements while under severe threat of artillery fire. It was the kind of operation that alters the course of global security, the kind that earns whispered legends in the classified corridors of the Pentagon. The physical toll was immense. My muscles screamed for rest, and my uniform bore the distinct scent of jet fuel and desert sand. But as I walked through the brightly lit, bustling airport terminal surrounded by tourists and business travelers, I was entirely invisible. They saw just another tired soldier heading home. They had no idea I held a security clearance higher than most elected officials. All I wanted was a hot shower, a solid meal, and a simple ride to my sister's wedding weekend in Newport, Rhode Island. I stopped near the baggage claim and pulled out my personal phone. The screen lit up with dozens of missed notifications from our family group chat. For the past 6 months, that chat had been an endless stream of Brittany demanding perfection for her bridal events. She obsessed over floral arrangements, champagne vintages, and the exact shade of ivory for the table linens. I usually kept my phone on silent, but today I needed a favor. I typed a quick, straightforward message. My flight just landed. Can someone pick me up from the airport? I leaned against a concrete pillar, letting the exhaustion wash over me. The response from my father Richard came less than a minute later. I stared at the glowing screen, letting the familiar sting of his words hit me. I did not change my expression. "No one cares about your Navy career," he wrote. "Take an Uber. We are busy entertaining Donovan's family. Do not embarrass us today." I locked my phone and shoved it deep into my pocket. I grabbed my faded olive-drab duffel bag, the heavy canvas scraping against my leg. There was absolutely no point in arguing or begging for basic familial decency. In Richard's eyes, success was only measured by profit margins, hostile corporate acquisitions, and high society networking. He owned one of the largest shipping and logistics companies on the East Coast, a sprawling empire built on aggressive contracts and ruthless negotiations. He expected his children to fall in line to serve as polished trophies that reflected his own magnitude. My decision to serve my country instead of taking a comfortable desk job at his company was nothing more than a blue-collar failure to him. He viewed my military service as an embarrassing detour, a topic he actively avoided or openly mocked at every opportunity. I walked out into the crisp New England air and caught a rideshare to the coastal resort. The hour-long drive to Newport gave me time to mentally brace myself for the weekend ahead. Outside the car window, the scenery shifted from busy highways to sweeping ocean views and towering historical mansions. The contrast between the violent, unpredictable war zone I had just left and the excessive, insulated wealth of this coastal town was jarring. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, shifting my mindset from combat commander to the quiet, obedient daughter my family expected me to play. We finally pulled up to the ultra-luxurious resort overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The sweeping circular driveway was packed with imported sports cars, gleaming black SUVs and valets rushing to open doors for women in designer gowns and men in sharply tailored suits. I stepped out of the unassuming sedan wearing my standard-issue combat fatigues. The fabric was still stiff with desert dust and dried sweat. I had literally not had a single second to change since ensuring my team made it onto the extraction flight alive. I slung my heavy duffel bag over my shoulder, paid the driver, and walked up the pristine marble steps toward the main entrance. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern luxury featuring towering crystal chandeliers, massive arched windows facing the ocean, and a string quartet playing soft classical music in the corner. I barely made it past the grand glass doors when a hand clamped down hard on my arm. It was Brittany, my 30-year-old sister, and the undisputed golden child of our family. She was wearing a custom silk dress that likely cost more than my annual base salary. She had been barking orders at a terrified hotel concierge just moments before, but now her entire focus was locked onto me. She looked me up and down, her perfectly contoured face twisting in absolute unfiltered disgust. "Are you seriously wearing the clothes you mop boat decks with to my rehearsal weekend?" she hissed, keeping her voice viciously low so the nearby wealthy guests would not hear her outburst. She tightened her manicured grip on my arm, trying to physically pull me back outside the glass doors. "You look like a homeless person who wandered off the street. Did you sleep in the dirt?" I looked at my sister, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion that had nothing to do with my 30-hour flight. "I did sleep in the dirt, Brittany," I replied calmly. "It was the only way to avoid sniper fire." Brittany rolled her eyes dramatically, completely unfazed by the reality of my life. "I do not care about your ridiculous war games, Diana," she snapped, glancing nervously over her shoulder to ensure no one was watching us. "Donovan's family is already here in the VIP lounge. His father is a 4-star general at the Pentagon, a man who commands actual respect and power. If they see my older sister looking like a disgraced low-level mechanic, it will completely ruin my aesthetic and humiliate Donovan. I will not let you destroy this weekend just because you are bitter and jealous of my success. You need to use the service elevator and hide in your room until you figure out how to look like a normal human being." 2 hours later, I stepped into the resort's grand ballroom for the rehearsal dinner. I had traded my dust-covered combat uniform for a simple, sharp black dress I kept packed for civilian transits. The room was an explosion of opulent wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung low over tables draped in imported silk. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. I walked past the head table where my parents and Donovan were already holding court, and checked the seating chart near the entrance. My name was not listed among the VIPs. It was not listed with the extended family. It was scrawled at the very bottom of the parchment. Table 14. I navigated through the maze of heavily perfumed guests until I reached the absolute back of the ballroom. Table 14 was a cramped, wobbly circle shoved directly against the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen. Every 30 seconds, a waiter would barge through the doors, nearly clipping my chair and sending a gust of hot, grease-scented air over the table. I took my seat next to a disgruntled guy in a polo shirt who turned out to be the DJ and a catering manager aggressively tapping on a clipboard. The catering manager shot me a miserable look. "Your father demanded a 5-course menu, but refused to pay for the extra prep staff. We are completely underwater back there. He expects Michelin star service on a fast food budget." I took a sip of my tap water. "That sounds exactly like Richard," I said. "He loves the illusion of luxury, as long as someone else pays the actual price." Before the manager could reply, the sharp ringing of a fork against crystal echoed through the ballroom. Brittany stood at the head table. She wore a glowing white evening gown and held a flute of champagne high in the air. The room quieted down, turning their collective attention to the bride. "I want to raise a glass to the two most important people in my life," Brittany announced, her voice echoing through the microphone. "My amazing parents, Richard and Patricia, they have always given me the absolute best. They sacrificed so much to pay my full tuition at Yale, ensuring I had the perfect foundation to meet a man as incredible as Donovan. They are the true definition of selfless love." The room erupted into polite, wealthy applause. Richard beamed, wrapping an arm around Patricia as they soaked in the adoration. I picked up my steak knife and drove it into the tough cut of meat on my plate. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically taste it. They had not sacrificed a single thing for Brittany's tuition. They had stolen it. My mind flashed back to the morning of my 18th birthday. I had just received my acceptance letter to a prestigious university, securing my path to a degree in international relations. I walked into Richard's home office to ask for the account details of the college fund my grandparents had established specifically for me. Richard had not even looked up from his computer screen. He simply slid a bank statement across his mahogany desk. The balance was zero. When I demanded to know where the money went, Richard laughed in my face. Brittany needed a Porsche for her senior year, he told me without a shred of remorse. She is entering high society circles, Diana. She needs the right aesthetic for networking. You can take out student loans or get a job at a diner. You were never going to amount to anything in the corporate world anyway. I did not cry. I did not scream. I took the empty bank statement, walked out of his house, and went straight to the nearest military recruitment center. I signed my life over to the United States Navy that very afternoon. The military became my family, my education, and my survival. While Brittany was driving a stolen Porsche to fraternity parties, I was enduring the most grueling tactical intelligence training on the planet. I was learning how to survive interrogations, how to lead men into combat, and how to dismantle criminal networks. They thought they had discarded a failure, but they had actually forged a weapon. I sliced off a piece of my steak, chewing it methodically as the applause for Brittany died down. Donovan stood up next, taking the microphone from his beaming bride. "We are so thrilled to merge our two families," Donovan said, his voice slick with practiced corporate charm. "Richard has built an incredible logistics empire, and my father has spent his life defending this great nation. Speaking of my father, he should be arriving any minute. I know Richard is very eager to sit down with him tonight to finalize a little business deal we have been working on." Donovan winked at my father. Richard practically vibrated with greed, raising his glass toward Donovan. The guest chuckled, completely unaware that the business deal they were laughing about involved defrauding the Department of Defense. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom. I knew exactly who Donovan was talking about. General Thomas was a legend in the Pentagon. He was a 4-star general who commanded immense respect across every branch of the military. He was also the man currently overseeing the highly classified extraction operation my team had just completed. Suddenly, the grand oak doors swung open. The lively chatter in the ballroom died instantly. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. The sheer command presence of the man entering the room demanded absolute silence. General Thomas stepped into the light. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, but he did not look like a man arriving to celebrate a joyful wedding rehearsal. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a war zone on his shoulders. He was 65 years old, a towering, imposing figure with an expression forged out of pure steel. His face was rigid with exhaustion and barely concealed fury. He was flanked by 2 stern-faced military aides who looked ready to clear the room by force if necessary. The air in the ballroom grew instantly cold. General Thomas did not smile at his son. He did not look at Brittany. He stood at the entrance, his eyes scanning the opulent crowd with a look of absolute disdain, as if the champagne flutes and silk dresses were a personal insult to his current state of mind. Richard scrambled out of his chair, nearly knocking over his own wineglass in his haste. He smoothed his suit jacket and rushed forward to greet the most powerful man in the room, completely oblivious to the storm clouds gathering in the general's eyes. At table 14, I quietly set down my steak knife and leaned back in my chair. The Vanguard was inbound and the first shockwave had just hit the shore. Richard practically tripped over the hem of Brittany's sprawling white gown in his desperate scramble to reach the entrance. He signaled frantically to one of his corporate lackeys, who immediately produced a thick gold-embossed leather folder. Richard snatched the folder and thrust it forward like a shield, stepping directly into the path of the 4-star general. "General Thomas, it is an absolute honor to finally host you." Richard beamed, his voice artificially loud, trying to project total control over a room that had just frozen in terror. "We have the private lounge prepared for the signing. I have the $500 million logistics contract right here, ready for your signature." He shoved the leather folder toward the general's chest. General Thomas did not even break his stride. He raised a massive hand and forcefully shoved the documents away, swatting the leather folder so hard it slipped from Richard's grasp and clattered onto the polished marble floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. "Not now, Richard!" General Thomas barked, his voice carrying the raw, unfiltered authority of a man who commanded armies. "I just lost contact with my best tactical team in the Middle East. I do not care about your freight contract." Richard stood paralyzed, his hands still raised in midair. His face drained of color, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. Donovan rushed forward, abandoning his bride at the head table, attempting to salvage his father-in-law's catastrophic misstep. "Dad, please," Donovan urged, placing a hand on the general's arm. "Richard has been setting this up for months. The board of directors is expecting the final confirmation tonight. Can we just take 5 minutes to sign the paperwork?" General Thomas turned his furious gaze on his son. The two military aides flanking the general instantly stepped forward physically, wedging themselves between the general and Donovan. "Did you not hear a single word I just said?" General Thomas growled, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. "I have 40 Allied operatives and the most elite extraction unit on the planet completely unaccounted for in a hostile desert. I am not here to play corporate games with your father-in-law. I need a secure room and a direct uplink to the Pentagon immediately." The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Wealthy socialites, corporate board members, and local politicians stared at their plates, terrified to make a sound. The catering manager sitting next to me at table 14 was trembling, his clipboard pressed tight against his chest. Sensing the total collapse of her perfect evening, my mother decided to intervene. Patricia had spent 30 years smoothing over Richard's aggressive business tactics with high society charm, and she foolishly believed those same country club manners could pacify a military commander facing a global crisis. She glided across the floor, her diamond necklace catching the light from the chandeliers. She placed a manicured hand over her heart and offered the general a sympathetic, deeply condescending smile. "General Thomas, please accept our deepest apologies." Patricia coos, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We understand entirely. Military life can be so terribly unpredictable. Please excuse the tension." She waved a dismissive, elegant hand directly toward the back of the room, pointing straight at my dark corner. "My eldest daughter over there is just a low-level sailor. She does not understand high-stakes stress like you do. We tried to teach her corporate responsibility. We tried to give her a respectable life in our company, but she chose to scrub decks instead. We know how difficult those entry-level military jobs can be on the nerves." I sat perfectly still, my posture relaxed. I did not break eye contact with my mother. Patricia was using my supposed failure as a conversational bridge, throwing me under the bus to build a false sense of camaraderie with a 4-star general. She wanted him to see her as a suffering parent, someone who could relate to the burden of military service because she had a disappointing daughter in uniform. I picked up my water glass. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I remembered the day I shipped out for basic training. Patricia had refused to come to the bus station. She had stood in the foyer of their mansion inspecting her nails and told me that if I insisted on throwing my life away to go play in the mud, she would not be there to watch me do it. She had erased me from the family narrative that very afternoon. Now she was parading my uniform around as a prop to salvage a business deal. General Thomas did not even glance in my direction. He did not care about Patricia's rambling, and he certainly did not care about the low-level sailor sitting by the kitchen doors. He looked at my mother as if she had just spoken to him in an alien language. "I have absolutely no interest in your family drama, Patricia." The general snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. He turned his back on her, completely dismissing her existence, and focused entirely on his lead communications aide. The aide held up a secure, encrypted tablet. "Sir, satellite uplink is attempting to re-establish the connection. We are pinging their last known coordinates, but the signal is being blocked by a local sandstorm. Central Command is requesting authorization to send a secondary rescue team." General Thomas rubbed his temples, his face etched with a profound, terrifying exhaustion. He looked like a man who knew he was running out of time. "Hold the secondary team," General Thomas ordered, his voice echoing in the dead-silent ballroom. "If we send another unit in blind, we risk losing them too." He lowered his hands and stared at the encrypted tablet, muttering a phrase that sent a visible shockwave through his aides. "If the Ghost Commander did not make it out with my men, heads will roll. I need an update from the Pentagon 5 minutes ago." Richard, Patricia, and Donovan stood in a stunned, useless circle. They had no idea what a tactical blackout meant. They did not know who the Ghost Commander was, nor did they grasp the sheer magnitude of the crisis unfolding in the middle of their rehearsal dinner. They only knew that their $500 million contract was lying ignored on the marble floor. At table 14, nestled right next to the swinging kitchen doors, I gently set my water glass down on the white linen tablecloth. The Ghost Commander. That was my classified call sign. It was the name whispered in Pentagon briefing rooms, the title given to the architect of the most impossible extractions the military had ever authorized. General Thomas was currently tearing his hair out, terrified that I had died in the desert, completely unaware that I was sitting less than 50 feet away from him wearing a cheap black dress and sharing a breadbasket with a terrified wedding DJ. I reached into the pocket of my dress. My thumb brushed against the cold, hard casing of my satellite phone. The Vanguard was inbound. The trap was set. All I had to do was stand up. I did not stand up. A tactical commander knows that timing is the difference between a skirmish and a total victory. Revealing my identity in the middle of a chaotic rehearsal dinner would only create a spectacle. I needed a surgical strike. I needed absolute leverage. Keeping my hands beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, I pulled out my encrypted satellite phone and quickly typed in my alpha clearance code. Ghost Commander Actual, extraction complete, 0 casualties. Vanguard team is secure. I hit send. Across the grand ballroom, the tense silence was broken by a sharp electronic chime. The sound came from the encrypted tablet held by General Thomas's lead aide. The young officer glanced at the glowing screen, his eyes widening in pure shock before he quickly leaned in and whispered directly into the general's ear. General Thomas snatched the tablet. I watched from the shadows of table 14 as the rigid, terrifying posture of the 4-star general instantly dissolved. The crushing weight of a disastrous military failure lifted off his shoulders in real time. He let out a massive, shuddering breath and closed his eyes. "They are secure," the general announced, his voice vibrating with profound relief. The unit made it out. Richard, entirely oblivious to the monumental gravity of what had just occurred, saw an opening and lunged for it. He scooped his gold-embossed leather folder off the marble floor and shoved it back toward the general. "That is wonderful news, General," Richard cheered, clapping his hands together. "Truly fantastic. Now, if we could just take 30 seconds to sign this logistics contract, my board of directors will be absolutely thrilled." General Thomas slowly turned his head, looking at my father as if he were a particularly irritating insect. The absolute disdain in the general's eyes was chilling. "I am returning to the base," Richard the general stated, his tone freezing the air in the room. "My finest soldiers are coming home alive, and I am going to ensure they receive the honors they deserve. Do not ever interrupt me with your corporate paperwork again." Without another word, General Thomas turned on his heel and marched out of the grand ballroom, his aides flanking him in perfect synchronization. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them. Richard was left standing completely alone in the center of the floor, holding his unsigned $500 million contract in the air like a fool. Donovan looked furious. Patricia looked utterly humiliated. I quietly pushed my chair back, slipped out the swinging kitchen doors, and headed up to my hotel suite. The first phase of the operation was complete. I needed sleep. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the sheer curtains of my resort suite. It was the day of Brittany's lavish wedding. I had slept for 8 solid hours, the first real rest I had managed in over a week. My mind was sharp, my muscles felt recovered, and I was ready to endure whatever superficial pageantry my family had planned. I threw off the covers and walked toward the master closet. The hotel concierge had hung my mandated bridesmaid dress inside the night before. It was a hideous, overly ruffled mauve monstrosity that Brittany had selected specifically to clash with my skin tone and make me look absurd next to her custom designer gown. It was a petty classic Brittany move, but I had agreed to wear it just to keep the peace. I opened the closet doors and stopped dead in my tracks. The mauve dress was destroyed. It hung from the wooden hanger in absolute ruins, slashed into jagged, frayed ribbons of silk and chiffon. Entire sections of the bodice had been violently hacked away, leaving a tangled mess of thread and ruined fabric pooling on the carpeted floor. Before I could even process the vandalism, the heavy wooden door connecting my suite to the adjoining bridal suite swung open. Brittany stepped into the room. She was already wearing her silk bridal robe, holding a pair of large silver fabric scissors in her right hand. She took one look at the closet and immediately launched into a theatrical performance. She gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her free hand, and squeezed her eyes shut to force out fake tears. "Oh my God, Diana!" Brittany cried out, her voice trembling with artificial horror. "Look at your dress. The hotel tailor must have completely ruined it while doing the final alterations. This is an absolute disaster. I guess you will just have to wear your ugly uniform or not attend the ceremony at all." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. A decade of interrogating hostile insurgents had made me immune to terrible acting. I simply crossed my arms and stared at her, letting the cold, heavy silence stretch between us until her fake tears dried up. Brittany dropped her hand from her mouth. Her theatrical pout melted into a malicious, deeply arrogant smirk. She tossed the heavy silver scissors onto my bed. "Fine," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I did it on purpose. Did you really think I was going to let you stand next to me in my bridal party? Look at yourself, Diana. You are a rough blue-collar grunt. You do not fit in with Donovan's family. You have never fit in with ours." She stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You ruin the aesthetic of this entire wedding. You have always been the ugly duckling, Diana. Just own it. Go hide in the back with the catering staff where you belong, or wear your pathetic work clothes so everyone can see exactly what a massive failure you turned out to be." I held her gaze, my expression an unreadable mask of calm precision. I let her relish her petty, hollow victory. She thought she had completely humiliated me. She thought she had stripped away my last shred of dignity. "Fine," I replied coldly, my voice perfectly smooth. "I will wear my uniform." Brittany laughed a sharp, triumphant sound. "Perfect. Do not stand too close to the cameras." She spun around and marched back into her bridal suite, slamming the connecting door shut. I turned away from the ruined mauve fabric and walked over to the reinforced heavy-duty military garment bag I had carried off the transport plane. I laid it flat on the bed and slowly unzipped the thick canvas. Inside was not the dust-covered, sweat-stained combat fatigues I had worn in the lobby. Inside was my pristine, stark white Navy service dress uniform. The fabric was flawlessly pressed, the gold buttons gleamed under the hotel lights, and the dark shoulder boards bore the unmistakable heavy gold stripes of a commanding officer. But the most formidable part of the uniform was pinned directly over the heart. A massive, colorful rack of medals and commendations. The Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Defense Superior Service Medal. It was a chest full of hardware that represented a lifetime of classified heroism, tactical brilliance, and unparalleled sacrifice. Brittany was too ignorant to recognize the rank. To her, it was just a blue-collar uniform. But to anyone who actually understood the military, it was the undeniable armor of a Titan. I carefully lifted the crisp white jacket from the garment bag. It was time for the wedding. I slipped my arms into the tailored sleeves of the Navy service dress uniform. The crisp, heavy white fabric settled over my shoulders flawlessly. I adjusted the collar, ensuring the gold oak leaves on my shoulder boards were perfectly aligned. Pinning the ribbon rack over my left breast pocket, I felt the familiar grounding weight of my service. The Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star with Valor. Each piece of enameled metal represented a mission survived, a life saved, a highly classified objective achieved in the darkest, most hostile corners of the globe. I checked my reflection in the hotel mirror one last time. There was no trace of the disheveled, exhausted woman who had arrived yesterday. Staring back at me was the ghost commander. I stepped out of the elevator and walked through the grand lobby of the resort. My black dress shoes clicked with rhythmic precision against the polished marble floor. Heads turned instantly. Conversations died in the middle of sentences. Wealthy guests holding morning mimosas lowered their crystal glasses, their eyes tracking the blinding white uniform and the heavy gold striping. Several resort staff members, recognizing the gravity of the rank I wore, immediately stood straighter and offered subtle nods of respect. I ignored the whispers. and the stairs keeping my posture rigid as I made my way out through the glass terrace doors. The morning air in the botanical gardens was crisp, carrying the heavy scent of imported orchids and freshly cut grass. The bridal party had completely taken over the central courtyard. The hired photographer, a frantic man sweating profusely through his linen suit, was desperately trying to arrange the chaotic mix of bridesmaids in their matching silk gowns and groomsmen in custom-tailored tuxedos. At the absolute center of it all stood Brittany and Donovan, posing like untouchable royalty holding court. Richard and Patricia hovered just out of frame, micromanaging the camera angles to ensure they looked adequately powerful and wealthy. I bypassed the lingering catering staff and stepped directly onto the pristine green lawn, moving toward the designated family grouping. The morning sunlight hit my chest, turning the array of medals into a blinding display of polished metal and colorful ribbons. The sudden flash of light caught Richard's attention. He spotted me before I even reached the outer edge of the group. His face instantly drained of color before flooding with a dark, furious red. He abandoned his conversation with the frantic photographer and stormed across the grass, closing the distance between us in seconds. He grabbed my elbow with a tight, punishing grip, attempting to drag me backward into the shadow of a large decorative hedge. During the pre-wedding family photos, Richard literally pushed me out of the frame. "Stand behind the groomsmen!" Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper so the hired staff would not hear. "What is this absolute circus act, Diana? Your medals look cheap and fake. General Thomas will think you're a fraud. He is already furious about whatever happened last night. If he sees you walking around his venue wearing stolen valor, he will cancel the logistics contract and ruin my company." I ripped my arm out of his grasp with a sharp tactical movement that left him stumbling slightly on the manicured grass. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I simply smoothed the pristine white sleeve of my jacket. Donovan chuckled, stepping out of his carefully curated pose at the center of the garden. He put a protective, arrogant arm around Brittany and flashed me a patronizing smile. "Come on, Richard. Let the grunt have her moment." Donovan sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "She probably bought those at a pawn shop downtown to feel important for one day. It is actually kind of sad. Just stick her in the back row where the shadows hide the cheap plastic." Brittany leaned into Donovan's chest, her laughter ringing out across the quiet garden. She glanced at the hotel trash can where the slashed remains of my mauve bridesmaid dress were likely still sitting, then looked back at my uniform with total disdain. "You always have to ruin the aesthetic, Diana." Brittany sighed dramatically. "You've always been the ugly duckling, Diana. Own it. Stand in the back and keep your mouth shut so you do not embarrass us any further." I did not scream. I did not argue. I did not waste my breath trying to explain the weight of the silver star to people who valued nothing but bank accounts and country club memberships. I stepped back exactly one pace, allowing the arrogant cluster of my family to fill the center of the frame. "Fine," I replied coldly, my voice cutting through the humid morning air. "I'll wear my uniform." The photographer, eager to move past the awkward family tension, frantically waved his hands to get everyone's attention. He adjusted his light meter, raised his heavy camera, and counted down from 3. Richard quickly pasted on a fake, glowing smile. Brittany tilted her head to catch the perfect angle of sunlight. As the photographer clicked the camera, the deafening roar of heavy diesel engines shattered the serene morning air. The ground beneath our feet literally vibrated. A massive military convoy materialized at the end of the long, palm-lined driveway. 3 black Suburbans and 2 heavily armored tactical transports crashed directly through the resort's front gates, completely ignoring the frantic shouts of the valet staff. The heavy iron gates swung wildly on their hinges as the convoy tore into the main courtyard, tires screeching against the pristine cobblestone. The flashing blue and red emergency lights reflected off the glass facade of the hotel, turning the elegant wedding venue into a high-security staging ground. Dozens of heavily armed soldiers poured out of the black Suburbans before the vehicles even came to a complete stop. They moved with terrifying synchronized speed, immediately establishing a tactical perimeter around the hotel courtyard. The doors to the armored transports swung open, revealing even more military personnel setting up communication uplinks and securing the resort entrances. Richard abandoned his spot in the family photo and charged toward the nearest soldier, his face purple with absolute rage. He jabbed a manicured finger directly at the chest of a sentry holding a tactical rifle. "I demand to know what is going on here," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the glass walls of the hotel. "I rented this entire courtyard I own, half the politicians in this state. Move these trucks right now, or I will have your commanding officer fired by noon." The sentry did not blink. He did not shift his stance. He simply looked at Richard from behind his dark tactical sunglasses. "Federal jurisdiction, sir," the sentry replied, his voice a flat, uncompromising bark. "This entire sector is locked down for a classified debriefing. Step back from the vehicle immediately." Richard was so shocked by the dismissal that he actually took a step backward, his mouth hanging open. Brittany, meanwhile, was having a total meltdown on the grass. She stomped her expensive satin heels, clutching the sides of her custom gown. "My photos!" Brittany shrieked, glaring at the armored transports ruining her backdrop. "Donovan, do something. They are ruining the lighting. This is supposed to be my perfect morning." Donovan quickly wrapped his arms around his frantic bride, shooting a nervous glance at the heavily armed soldiers. He steered her away from the courtyard, whispering desperately to soothe her ego. "We will just move the ceremony to the grand lawn early," Donovan promised. "It overlooks the ocean. It is totally secluded. We will not let them ruin your aesthetic, baby, I promise." Despite the military occupation of the hotel entrance, Richard and Patricia refused to let the wedding schedule falter. They aggressively ushered the bewildered wealthy guests through the hotel corridors and out onto the oceanfront grand lawn. The ceremony space was undeniably beautiful. Hundreds of white wooden chairs were lined up with mathematical precision on the emerald green grass. A massive floral arch woven with imported white roses stood at the altar, framing the crashing ocean waves behind it. A string quartet played softly in the corner, trying to restore the illusion of high society elegance. I found my assigned seat. True to their word, my parents had placed my name card in the absolute very last row, tucked far away on the outer edge, directly next to a towering audio speaker. They wanted me out of sight. They wanted me invisible. But a stark white Navy service dress uniform dripping with gold stripes and combat medals does not blend into the background. As the billionaire CEOs, local politicians, and wealthy socialites took their seats in their pastel linen suits and floral dresses, their eyes continuously darted back to me. The sheer command presence of the uniform demanded attention. I sat perfectly straight, my hands resting on my knees, ignoring their confused, whispering stares. The music swelled. The crowd stood. Brittany walked down the long, white-carpeted aisle, her arm looped through Richard's. She wore a smug, triumphant smile, soaking in the admiration of the crowd. She took her place next to Donovan at the altar. The officiant, a hired local celebrity, stepped up to the microphone and began speaking. He launched into a lengthy, deeply pretentious speech about corporate synergy merging empires and the undeniable power of elite wealth. I kept my eyes locked on the horizon, watching the dark clouds gathering over the ocean. I was waiting for the signal. Just as Brittany took a deep breath, preparing to read her customized self-indulgent vows, a low thrumming started in the distance. It was a vibration you felt in your chest before you actually heard it. The water in the decorative floral vases began to ripple. The billionaire guests shifted in their seats, looking around in confusion. The thrumming rapidly escalated into a deafening mechanical roar that swallowed the string quartet whole. 3 massive military helicopters crested the roofline of the resort like predatory birds. There were 2 sleek, blacked-out MH-60 Blackhawks and 1 hulking, heavily armed MH-47 Chinook. They surged over the hotel and banked sharply, descending directly toward the oceanfront lawn. The rotor wash hit the wedding ceremony like a Category 5 hurricane. The sheer force of the downdraft tore the imported white roses to shreds, raining a violent storm of petals over the screaming guests. Expensive summer hats were ripped from heads and blown over the cliffs into the ocean. The silk draping on the chairs whipped wildly in the wind, knocking over audio equipment. The wealthy elite ducked and covered their heads, completely panicked by the sudden, overwhelming display of military force. Brittany lost her mind. Her designer veil was ripped from her hair and sent tumbling across the grass. She clutched her dress, screaming directly into the microphone. "Make them stop!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the roaring engines. "My vows! You are ruining my aesthetic! Tell them to go away!" Richard was absolutely apoplectic. The veins in his neck bulged as he sprinted away from his seat and grabbed the terrified venue manager by the lapels of his suit. "Shoot them down!" Richard screamed over the deafening roar of the rotors, shaking the manager violently. "Call your security team and shoot those things down right now. I am losing millions of dollars in photography." The absolute absurdity of a corporate CEO demanding a wedding planner shoot down United States military aircraft was entirely lost on Richard. He was blinded by his own ego. The helicopters did not leave. They did not circle away. They hovered directly over the manicured lawn, the deafening noise drowning out the panicked screams of the bridal party. The side doors of the Blackhawks slid open. Thick, heavy fast ropes uncoiled from the bays, dropping straight down toward the pristine grass of the wedding aisle. Dark figures emerged from the hovering choppers. Dozens of heavily armed elite Navy SEALs, clad in full tactical gear, gripped the ropes. They dropped from the sky with terrifying speed and lethal precision. Their heavy combat boots hit the manicured grass in perfect unison, tearing up the turf. Within seconds, the operatives had unclipped from the ropes and raised their rifles, forming an impenetrable outward-facing tactical perimeter directly around the wedding altar. The sheer volume of the rotor wash began to fade as the helicopters pulled up and banked away, leaving a ringing silence punctuated only by the hysterical shrieks of the wedding guests. Panic consumed the grand lawn in a matter of seconds. Billionaire CEOs who routinely decimated entire corporate divisions with a single phone call were now crawling on their hands and knees, ruining custom-tailored Italian suits in the damp, muddy grass. Wealthy socialites clutched their ruined, windblown designer hats and scrambled frantically behind the overturned white wooden chairs, slipping and tripping over their expensive high heels. The hired string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments in a desperate bid for safety, leaving a priceless antique cello lying trampled in the mud beneath the fleeing crowd. Donovan, who had spent the entire morning projecting the arrogant, untouchable confidence of a master of the universe, instantly folded under the pressure. He tried to puff out his chest and yell a command at the intruders, but his voice cracked into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. The second a towering Navy SEAL stepped within 5 feet of the altar, Donovan physically recoiled. All of his fake bravado melted into pure cowardice. He scrambled backward, tripping over the hem of Brittany's ruined designer veil, abandoning his bride entirely, and cowered directly behind his father's broad shoulders, using the older man as a human shield. General Thomas stood his ground like a statue carved from solid granite, completely unbothered by the aggressive tactical insertion happening around him. However, his eyes darted rapidly across the lawn, analyzing the situation with the sharp, calculated precision of a seasoned combat veteran. He knew instantly that the operation was far from over. The heavy armored doors of the black Suburbans parked at the front gates burst open. Dozens more heavily armed operatives flooded the venue, their tactical gear rattling as they sprinted toward the lawn. The sheer scale of the military presence was staggering. There were nearly 200 elite Navy SEALs swarming the private resort property. But the initial blinding panic of the wealthy crowd slowly morphed into a deep, paralyzing confusion. The soldiers were not attacking. They were not securing hostages or sweeping the perimeter for armed threats. They were moving with a synchronized, almost choreographed purpose that defied the chaos they had just created. Rifles were lowered and snapped firmly to their chests in a resting position. The operatives marched directly into the center of the devastated wedding venue. They moved the terrified guests out of the way, not with violence or aggression, but with rigid, unyielding authority. They cleared the main aisle entirely, kicking aside the crushed white roses and shattered crystal floral arrangements that had cost more than a small house. Within seconds, the chaotic swarming mob of soldiers transformed into a perfect, flawless military formation. The SEALs lined up shoulder to shoulder, facing inward toward the center of the lawn. They created a rigid, pristine corridor of honor that stretched all the way from the flower-strewn altar straight down the white carpeted center aisle and led directly to the very back of the venue. The sheer discipline was terrifying and magnificent to watch. 200 men standing at absolute attention, breathing in perfect unison, their expressions locked into stone-cold masks of unwavering respect. Richard crawled out from behind a fallen floral pillar, his face smeared with dirt and grass stains, staring at the double line of elite warriors, splitting his multi-million-dollar wedding in half. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, totally incapable of comprehending the scene. Patricia was weeping openly on the ground, clutching a ruined silk napkin to her chest, her carefully constructed high society world completely destroyed in under a minute. Donovan peeked out from behind General Thomas, his eyes wide with sheer terror. General Thomas surveyed the immaculate formation with a deeply furrowed brow. He was a four-star general, a man who had commanded massive theaters of war, and even he looked completely baffled by the display. He knew a tactical honor guard when he saw one. He knew the precise posture, the perfectly squared shoulders, the rigid discipline radiating from the men. This was not a rescue mission. This was a formal tribute. But for whom he looked around the altar, glancing at his terrified son, the weeping bride, and the groveling corporate executives. None of them commanded this level of extreme military reverence. None of them warranted an unannounced, heavily armed formation of the most lethal operatives on the planet. A single figure broke away from the front of the tactical convoy, parked near the entrance. The SEAL commander. He wore the coveted trident pin proudly on his tactical vest, his boots crunching heavily against the gravel path as he marched straight toward the grand lawn. The terrified crowd parted for him like water. He did not look at Richard. He completely ignored Brittany, who was still clutching her ruined dress and sobbing hysterically near the altar. He marched with lethal measured strides right down the center of the human corridor, passing the ranks of his own men. When he reached the exact middle of the aisle, he stopped dead. He executed a flawless, crisp military pivot, turning his back on the altar and facing the very last row of the wedding venue. The SEAL commander drew in a massive breath, his chest expanding under his heavy tactical armor, and let out a command that boomed like rolling thunder across the devastated lawn. Detail attention. The response was instantaneous and absolutely deafening. 200 heavy combat boots slammed together against the earth in absolute flawless synchronization. The sound cracked through the humid ocean air like a physical blow. The entire perimeter snapped to rigid attention, their bodies locking into perfect, unyielding posture. The commander raised his voice again, screaming with a level of raw, unfiltered reverence that shook the very foundation of the resort. Admiral on deck. General Thomas physically recoiled. The words hit him like a freight train. His jaw actually dropped. All the color instantly drained from his weathered face. He was a four-star general, but the title of Admiral, especially one commanding a massive elite SEAL unit, was a level of operational authority that demanded absolute, unquestioning submission. He turned around slowly, his wide eyes tracing the path of the human corridor. The perfectly straight line of elite soldiers bypassed the billionaires, ignored the politicians, and bypassed the socialites. The corridor of honor led directly to the shadows of the very last row. It ended exactly where I was sitting. I stood up. The morning sunlight broke through the dark gathering clouds and hit the pristine white fabric of my Navy service dress uniform. The light caught the heavy gold stripes on my shoulders and the massive, colorful rack of combat medals on my chest, turning me into a blinding, undeniable display of absolute power. The sheer volume of the rotor wash began to fade as the helicopters pulled up and banked away, leaving a ringing silence punctuated only by the hysterical shrieks of the wedding guests. Panic consumed the grand lawn in a matter of seconds. Billionaire CEOs who routinely decimated entire corporate divisions with a single phone call were now crawling on their hands and knees, ruining custom-tailored Italian suits in the damp, muddy grass. Wealthy socialites clutched their ruined, wind-blown designer hats and scrambled frantically behind the overturned white wooden chairs, slipping and tripping over their expensive high heels. The hired string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments in a desperate bid for safety, leaving a priceless antique cello lying trampled in the mud beneath the fleeing crowd. Donovan, who had spent the entire morning projecting the arrogant, untouchable confidence of a master of the universe, instantly folded under the pressure. He tried to puff out his chest and yell a command at the intruders, but his voice cracked into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. The second, a towering Navy SEAL, stepped within 5 feet of the altar. Donovan physically recoiled. All of his fake bravado melted into pure cowardice. He scrambled backward, tripping over the hem of Brittany's ruined designer veil, abandoning his bride entirely, and cowered directly behind his father's broad shoulders, using the older man as a human shield. General Thomas stood his ground like a statue carved from solid granite, completely unbothered by the aggressive tactical insertion happening around him. However, his eyes darted rapidly across the lawn, analyzing the situation with the sharp, calculated precision of a seasoned combat veteran. He knew instantly that the operation was far from over. The heavy armored doors of the black Suburbans parked at the front gates burst open. Dozens more heavily armed operatives flooded the venue, their tactical gear rattling as they sprinted toward the lawn. The sheer scale of the military presence was staggering. There were nearly 200 elite Navy SEALs swarming the private resort property. But the initial blinding panic of the wealthy crowd slowly morphed into a deep, paralyzing confusion. The soldiers were not attacking, they were not securing hostages or sweeping the perimeter for armed threats. They were moving with a synchronized, almost choreographed purpose that defied the chaos they had just created. Rifles were lowered and snapped firmly to their chests in a resting position. The operatives marched directly into the center of the devastated wedding venue. They moved the terrified guests out of the way, not with violence or aggression, but with rigid, unyielding authority. They cleared the main aisle entirely, kicking aside the crushed white roses and shattered crystal floral arrangements that had cost more than a small house. Within seconds, the chaotic, swarming mob of soldiers transformed into a perfect, flawless military formation. The SEALs lined up shoulder to shoulder, facing inward toward the center of the lawn. They created a rigid, pristine corridor of honor that stretched all the way from the flower-strewn altar straight down the white-carpeted center aisle and led directly to the very back of the venue. The sheer discipline was terrifying and magnificent to watch. 200 men standing at absolute attention, breathing in perfect unison, their expressions locked into stone-cold masks of unwavering respect. Richard crawled out from behind a fallen floral pillar, his face smeared with dirt and grass stains, staring at the double line of elite warriors splitting his multi-million-dollar wedding in half. His mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water, totally incapable of comprehending the scene. Patricia was weeping openly on the ground, clutching a ruined silk napkin to her chest, her carefully constructed high society world completely destroyed in under a minute. Donovan peeked out from behind General Thomas, his eyes wide with sheer terror. General Thomas surveyed the immaculate formation with a deeply furrowed brow. He was a 4-star general, a man who had commanded massive theaters of war, and even he looked completely baffled by the display. He knew a tactical honor guard when he saw one. He knew the precise posture, the perfectly squared shoulders, the rigid discipline radiating from the men. This was not a rescue mission. This was a formal tribute. But for whom he looked around the altar, glancing at his terrified son, the weeping bride, and the groveling corporate executives. None of them commanded this level of extreme military reverence. None of them warranted an unannounced, heavily armed formation of the most lethal operatives on the planet. A single figure broke away from the front of the tactical convoy parked near the entrance, the SEAL commander. He wore the coveted trident pin proudly on his tactical vest, his boots crunching heavily against the gravel path as he marched straight toward the grand lawn. The terrified crowd parted for him like water. He did not look at Richard. He completely ignored Brittany, who was still clutching her ruined dress and sobbing hysterically near the altar. He marched with lethal measured strides right down the center of the human corridor, passing the ranks of his own men. When he reached the exact middle of the aisle, he stopped dead. He executed a flawless, crisp military pivot, turning his back on the altar and facing the very last row of the wedding venue. The SEAL commander drew in a massive breath, his chest expanding under his heavy tactical armor, and let out a command that boomed like rolling thunder across the devastated lawn. Detail, attention. The response was instantaneous and absolutely deafening. 200 heavy combat boots slammed together against the earth in absolute flawless synchronization. The sound cracked through the humid ocean air like a physical blow. The entire perimeter snapped to rigid attention, their bodies locking into perfect, unyielding posture. The commander raised his voice again, screaming with a level of raw, unfiltered reverence that shook the very foundation of the resort. Admiral on deck. General Thomas physically recoiled. The words hit him like a freight train. His jaw actually dropped. All the color instantly drained from his weathered face. He was a 4-star general, but the title of Admiral, especially one commanding a massive elite SEAL unit, was a level of operational authority that demanded absolute, unquestioning submission. He turned around slowly, his wide eyes tracing the path of the human corridor. The perfectly straight line of elite soldiers bypassed the billionaires, ignored the politicians, and bypassed the socialites. The corridor of honor led directly to the shadows of the very last row. It ended exactly where I was sitting. I stood up. The morning sunlight broke through the dark gathering clouds and hit the pristine white fabric of my Navy service dress uniform. The light caught the heavy gold stripes on my shoulders and the massive, colorful rack of combat medals on my chest, turning me into a blinding, undeniable display of absolute power. General Thomas did not blink. The blood had entirely left his weathered face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old under the harsh morning sun. He stared at the thick gold striping on my sleeves and the unmistakable, impossible array of combat commendations pinned over my heart. His eyes locked onto the silver star, then the trident insignia, processing the sheer magnitude of what those symbols represented in the hierarchy of global military operations. For 10 excruciating seconds, the entire venue was trapped in a vacuum of utter silence, save for the distant crashing of the ocean waves against the cliffs. Then the 4-star general moved. He shoved his way past the trembling figure of his son, completely ignoring Donovan's pathetic attempts to hide behind him. Richard, still hyperventilating about his ruined floral arrangements and corporate contracts, stepped into the general's path, raising his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. General Thomas did not even break his stride. He shoved a heavy, calloused hand against Richard's chest physically, throwing the billionaire CEO out of his way with the careless force of a man swatting aside an insect. Richard stumbled backward, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping on the wet grass, and crashed into an overturned row of white wooden chairs. General Thomas marched down the center of the white carpeted aisle. On either side of him, the 200 elite Navy SEALs remained locked at absolute rigid attention. They did not flinch. They did not look at the weeping socialites or the groveling executives. They kept their eyes fixed straight ahead, forming a flawless, impenetrable wall of tactical discipline. Every step the general took echoed like a drumbeat. The wealthy guests, still kneeling in the mud and clutching their ruined designer clothing, watched in horrified fascination. They watched the man who commanded armies, a man who possessed enough political and military power to crush any corporation in the state, walk with urgent, almost desperate reverence toward the very back of the venue, toward the shadows, toward me. He stopped exactly 2 paces in front of me. Up close, I could see the profound physical toll the last 48 hours had taken on him. The deep lines etched around his mouth, the dark, heavy bags under his eyes. This was a man who had spent the last 2 days believing he had sent 40 of his best men to die in a highly classified, totally compromised hostile extraction zone. He had believed they were ghosts. General Thomas straightened his spine. He squared his shoulders, pulling his posture into flawless military alignment. Without a single word of hesitation, the four-star general snapped a razor-sharp salute. His hand sliced through the air and locked precisely at the brim of his brow. It was not a casual greeting. It was the highest, most profound display of military respect a soldier could offer. He was saluting the family disappointment. He was saluting the woman his son had just called a pawnshop fraud. I held his gaze, my face a mask of stone-cold composure. Slowly, with deliberate and punishing precision, I raised my right hand and returned the salute. The crisp snap of my white uniform sleeve cut through the heavy silence of the garden. I held it for exactly 2 seconds before snapping my arm back to my side. Only then did the general lower his hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the booming bark of a commander. It was thick, raw, and breaking with overwhelming emotion. It carried over the hushed, terrified crowd, broadcasting my absolute reality to every single person who had spent the last 24 hours treating me like garbage. Commander Diana, General Thomas said, his voice shaking. We received the encrypted signal at 0400 hours this morning. You brought them back. You brought all 40 of my men home alive from the extraction zone. The words dropped like live grenades onto the manicured grass. A collective strangled gasp rippled through the audience. The odds were impossible. The general continued, ignoring the crowd entirely, his eyes locked onto mine, with fierce, unyielding gratitude. Command structure had written them off as a total loss. We thought they were dead. We thought you were dead. But you held the line. The president has been briefed on the operation. He has authorized your immediate promotion to Rear Admiral. You are a national hero. The sheer weight of those words paralyzed the entire wedding party. The elite guests, the politicians, the corporate titans, they all froze, their brains completely short-circuiting as they tried to process the impossible truth unfolding right in front of them. The ugly duckling, the grunt, the woman they had shoved into the back row to preserve their precious aesthetic, had just been declared a national hero by the President of the United States. Near the front of the aisle, Patricia was standing frozen, her knuckles white as she gripped a crystal wine glass she had managed to hold onto during the helicopter insertion. The blood drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her fingers simply gave out. The heavy crystal glass slipped from her grasp and plummeted to the stone paver beneath her feet. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, the sharp crash echoing violently across the dead silent lawn. Brittany stood at this altar, her custom gown stained with mud and shredded flower petals. Her hands trembled uncontrollably at her sides. The arrogant, triumphant bride who had just demanded I hide in the shadows was now staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Donovan was still cowering near the floral arch, his mouth hanging open in pathetic disbelief, realizing he had just mocked one of the most lethal, highly decorated commanders in the United States military. Richard scrambled up from the overturned chairs, his suit jacket torn and covered in dirt. His face was a mask of furious, desperate denial. He could not accept it. His entire worldview, his absolute need for control and superiority, was being publicly dismantled. He pointed a trembling manicured finger at me, his voice pitching into a hysterical, strained squawk. "Wait," General Richard stammered, stepping wildly toward the center aisle. "She is just a low-level data entry clerk. She works in a cubicle." I did not even turn my head to acknowledge Richard. His desperate screaming faded into the ocean breeze as if he had never spoken at all. General Thomas completely ignored him as well. A 4-star general does not engage with a frantic civilian throwing a tantrum on the grass. The wall of Navy SEALs remained perfectly still. Not a single muscle twitched. To them, Richard was nothing more than background noise. My father stood there trembling in his ruined suit, his fingers still pointing at me, completely paralyzed by the realization that his wealth meant absolutely nothing in this arena. His money could buy politicians, but it could not buy the loyalty of 200 elite warriors. But Brittany refused to be ignored. Her entire reality was structured around being the absolute center of the universe. This was her highly curated wedding day, paid for with stolen money, designed to launch her into the highest echelon of society. And now the sister she had forced into the shadows was commanding the undivided respect of the most powerful men in the country. It broke her fragile ego completely. She stomped down the center aisle, her ruined designer dress dragging heavily through the mud and crushed flower petals. Her face was contorted with a vicious, unhinged rage. "Excuse me," Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking as she marched right up to the line of heavily armed soldiers. "You are ruining my wedding. This is a private event." She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me, ignoring the sheer danger of aggressively approaching a military detail. "Arrest her or something. She is not a hero. She is a fraud. Get these awful trucks off my lawn right now." A towering seal immediately shifted his rifle, stepping directly into Brittany's path to physically block her from advancing any closer to me or the general. The sharp clatter of tactical gear snapping into a defensive position finally snapped Donovan out of his cowardly stupor. Donovan was an arrogant finance executive, but he was not completely stupid. He recognized absolute power when he saw it. He realized that his father, a man who rarely showed emotion, had just saluted a woman Donovan had openly mocked hours earlier. Donovan sprinted down the aisle, his luxury shoes slipping on the wet grass. He grabbed Brittany by the shoulders and forcefully pulled her back before she could assault a federal officer. He looked terrified, his eyes darting frantically between my stark white uniform and his father's furious expression. Donovan tried to deploy his slick corporate charm, plastering a desperate, nervous laugh onto his face to save himself from the impending disaster. He desperately needed to restore the social hierarchy he understood. "General Dad." "Please," Donovan stammered, holding his struggling bride back. "There is obviously a massive misunderstanding here. You must have the wrong person." He pointed at me, forcing another hollow chuckle. "This is Diana. She is just my broke sister-in-law. She could not afford a real career, so she joined the Navy to pay her bills. She is absolutely not a commander of anything important. There has been a mix-up with your intelligence briefing. She probably bought those medals online to trick you." I stood silently, watching Donovan dig his own grave. I did not need to defend myself. I did not need to shout or justify my existence. I simply let the weight of my uniform speak for me. General Thomas slowly turned away from me and locked his eyes onto his son. The temperature in the garden seemed to drop 10 degrees. The billionaire guests, still cowering near the overturned chairs, watched in horrified fascination. General Thomas was a man of immense pride and dignity, a man who had earned his 4 stars through blood and sacrifice. Seeing his own son act with such disgusting privileged arrogance in front of a decorated combat veteran ignited a fire of pure wrath in his chest. General Thomas stepped right up to Donovan. He did not yell. He did not need to. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that carried absolute authority. "Broke." General Thomas growled, his eyes blazing with fury. "You arrogant, ignorant fool. This woman commands the highest tier intelligence unit in the armed forces. She orchestrates global operations that keep people like you safe while you sleep in your silk sheets." Donovan swallowed hard, all the color draining from his face as his father stepped even closer, backing him into the muddy grass. Brittany stopped struggling, her mouth hanging open as the reality of the situation finally pierced her thick bubble of delusion. "She has clearance levels I do not even possess." General Thomas continued, his voice dripping with pure disgust. "She is the reason 40 of my best men are coming home to their families tonight, instead of coming home in flag-draped coffins. You are not fit to shine her combat boots, Donovan. If you ever disrespect her again, if you ever speak to an admiral with that tone, I will disown you. I will strip you of my name and leave you with absolutely nothing. Do you understand me?" Donovan shrank back, his face completely devoid of color. He nodded frantically, too terrified of his father to even articulate a verbal response. The threat of losing his massive trust fund and his prestigious family name instantly shattered the last remaining pieces of his fake bravado. He abandoned Brittany entirely, pressing himself backward into the decorative floral archway, as if trying to physically melt into the woodwork. The absolute silence that followed the general's devastating threat was broken by a sudden jarring sound, A loud, wet bark of laughter. It came from Richard. The corporate titan had just watched his daughter be declared a national hero and a high-ranking military commander. For a normal father, this would be a moment of profound pride shock or even tearful reconciliation. For Richard, a man who viewed human beings strictly as commodities and leverage, it was a sudden massive shift in market value. The gears in his calculating head locked into a brand new configuration. He did not see an estranged daughter standing before him. He saw an infinitely valuable corporate asset. Richard smoothed the lapels of his dirt-stained suit jacket. He pasted on a smile so wide and aggressive it looked painful. He completely ignored the heavily armed SEALs standing just feet away and marched directly down the aisle with his arms spread wide. "My brilliant daughter," Richard bellowed, his voice projecting across the silent, devastated lawn. He laughed again, a booming artificial sound designed to charm boardrooms and manipulate investors. "General, do you see the genes she inherited? The drive, the absolute dedication to excellence. I always knew she was destined for absolute greatness. I told Patricia just this morning how incredibly proud I am of our girl." He lunged forward, attempting to wrap me in a tight, performative embrace for the benefit of the watching billionaires. He wanted to physically claim me to tether my newly revealed federal power directly to his corporate empire. He needed everyone to believe we were a united front. I did not even blink. I executed a precise tactical step backward. My movement was so sharp and cleanly calculated that Richard grasped empty air. He stumbled forward, his arms wrapping around nothing, his momentum carrying him awkwardly into the space I had just occupied. He nearly lost his footing on the damp grass, flailing his arms to remain upright. Instantly, the two elite Navy SEALs flanking the aisle shifted their rifles. The metallic clatter of weapons being raised a fraction of an inch cut through the heavy, humid air. It was a subtle, highly trained warning. Richard froze immediately, his hands still raised in the air, suddenly very aware of the lethal, unforgiving force surrounding him. "Keep your hands exactly where they are," Richard, I commanded. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any daughterly affection or familial warmth. "You do not get to claim me now. You lost that right a decade ago when you told me my service was a pathetic waste of your resources." Richard swallowed hard, lowering his hands slowly to his sides. But his relentless greed was far stronger than his fear or his public shame. He forced the sickening smile back onto his face, leaning in with a conspiratorial wink, completely oblivious to the gravity of the military operation taking place. "We are family," Diana, Richard urged, his tone dropping into a slick, persuasive cadence. "Families fight. Families say things they do not mean. But at the end of the day, we protect our own." And speaking of protecting our own, General Thomas here and I were just finalizing the details of a massive supply chain agreement. Now about that $500 million logistics contract. With you at the Admiral level, we can streamline the entire approval process. We can keep this all in the family and secure a very lucrative future for all of us. The sheer audacity of his request made a few of the nearby corporate executives actually gasp aloud. Richard was actively attempting to leverage my classified military rank to secure a massive federal contract right in front of a four-star general. He was treating a top-tier intelligence operative like a corrupt corporate lobbyist. I reached into the breast pocket of my pristine white Navy service dress uniform. My fingers bypassed the heavy gold buttons and extracted a small, heavily encrypted titanium flash drive. I held it up between us. The sleek, brushed metal caught the bright morning sunlight glinting sharply in the tense atmosphere. "I am incredibly glad you brought up that specific contract, Richard," I stated. I pitched my voice perfectly, ensuring that every single wealthy guest, local politician, and high society socialite could hear every single word I said. "You see, my intelligence unit does not just handle overseas threat extraction and hostile rescues. Part of our mandate is auditing domestic defense contractors for critical national security threats. When millions of taxpayer dollars and the lives of deployed service members are on the line, we investigate everything. And I mean absolutely everything." The confident, greedy smile vanished entirely from Richard's face. A bead of cold sweat formed at his temple and rolled slowly down his cheek. He stared at the titanium drive as if I were holding a live explosive. I turned my attention away from my father and extended my hand, offering the titanium drive directly to General Thomas. The four-star general reached out and took it. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he recognized the high-level encryption seal stamped onto the casing. His posture shifted from military respect to cold, unforgiving fury. General, my team ran a full, highly classified audit on his logistics company last night at 0200 hours. I declared, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. The silence on the Grand Lawn was absolute. No one dared to move. The results are on that drive. I continued, pointing to the device in the general's hand. He has been systematically falsifying safety inspection records on armor plating intended for forward operating bases. He has been signing off on defective gear that would have cost American lives. Worse, he has been actively funneling classified military funds into untraceable offshore shell accounts. I paused, letting the devastating, undeniable truth hang heavily in the air. I turned my gaze toward Brittany. She was shaking violently at the altar, her face streaked with ruined makeup, staring at me with wide, horrified eyes. I looked back at my father, who was now trembling uncontrollably, his corporate empire burning to ashes in front of his eyes. He used those exact stolen federal funds to pay for this pristine multi-million-dollar wedding. Richard stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked like a wax corpse left out in the sun. His perfectly tailored Italian suit suddenly seemed 2 sizes too big for his trembling frame. He tried to open his mouth to formulate a lie, to spin a counter-narrative, to assert the dominance he had wielded over me for my entire life, but his throat seized entirely. He knew exactly what was on that drive. He knew his offshore shell companies were buried beneath layers of corporate obfuscation that only military-grade decryption could breach. He was completely trapped, and he knew it. Patricia, however, possessed neither the intelligence to understand the legal peril nor the self-awareness to stay quiet. The destruction of her perfect society event was simply unacceptable. She surged forward, her diamond jewelry clattering, as she pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, refusing to accept the reality unfolding in front of her. "You are lying!" Patricia screamed, her voice shrill and echoing violently across the silent manicured lawn. "You are just jealous of Brittany. You have always been jealous of her. You are making up this ridiculous story because you could not stand watching her marry into a prominent family while you have absolutely nothing." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I looked down at my mother with nothing but clinical, terrifying detachment. "I have a verified federal audit, Patricia." I stated, my words cutting through her hysterical shrieks like a polished steel blade. "You have a daughter whose wedding cake was purchased with money stolen from the body armor budget of deployed Marines. Do not talk to me about jealousy. You are defending a traitor." General Thomas ignored Patricia entirely. He unclipped a rugged, secure military tablet from his tactical belt. The heavy device was encased in thick, shock-proof rubber and glowed with a harsh blue light as it powered up in his massive hands. With a sharp, deliberate movement, he inserted the titanium flash drive into the secure port. The silence on the Grand Lawn became agonizing. 200 elite Navy SEALs stood locked in perfect formation, their fingers resting near the trigger guards of their rifles, their eyes scanning the terrified crowd. The billionaire executives who had been drinking Richard's expensive champagne just an hour ago were now actively inching away from him. They were treating the corporate titan like a walking contagion. Nobody in that high society crowd wanted to be standing anywhere near a man about to be indicted for federal crimes. The social hierarchy of the entire venue shifted in the span of 30 seconds. General Thomas swiped his heavy finger across the reinforced screen. He opened the encrypted file directory. His eyes darted back and forth as he scanned the executive summaries, the offshore routing numbers, and the falsified inspection certificates, with Richard's digital signature stamped right at the bottom. The four-star general's face hardened into a mask of pure, unforgiving wrath. The muscles in his jaw ticked. He looked up from the glowing screen and locked his gaze onto Richard. The sheer contempt radiating from the general was palpable, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the surrounding guests physically recoil. "It is all here," General Thomas growled, his voice vibrating with a level of anger that shook the gravel path beneath his boots. "Every single forged document, every routed payment, fraud, embezzlement, treason." Richard let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. He swayed on his feet, his knees buckling under the weight of his total destruction. He finally realized that his vast wealth and corporate influence could not shield him from military justice. He opened his hands in a weak, begging gesture, trying to step toward the general to negotiate an impossible deal to save his own skin. "Do not take another step toward me," General Thomas commanded, his voice cracking like a whip through the humid air. Two massive SEAL operatives immediately stepped forward, their heavy combat boots crunching against the earth. They formed a solid, unyielding physical barrier between the general and the disgraced CEO, their posture aggressively defensive. Richard froze, his hands still raised in pathetic surrender. "The logistics contract is terminated," General Thomas declared, delivering the final absolute death blow to Richard's empire. "You are finished. My men will be contacting the FBI immediately to secure your assets and initiate a federal warrant. You are going to spend the rest of your natural life in a maximum security penitentiary." The absolute finality of the general's words shattered the last fragile remnants of Brittany's highly curated fantasy. She could not comprehend federal prison. She could not process treason or offshore shell accounts, or the fact that her father had endangered American lives. Her entire worldview was restricted to Instagram aesthetics, luxury vacations, and unearned social dominance. And her perfect, expensive day had just been completely annihilated by the sister she viewed as completely worthless. Brittany let out a piercing, unhinged wail. She collapsed to her knees in the damp grass, completely ignoring the mud that was rapidly soaking into her ruined, custom-designed silk wedding dress. She thrashed her arms wildly, weeping with pure, selfish outrage, acting like a toddler denied a toy, rather than a woman whose family had just been exposed as criminals. "No!" Brittany screamed, her face contorted into an ugly mask of furious entitlement. "This is not fair. You cannot do this today. Donovan, tell them to stop. Tell your father to leave us alone. We are supposed to go to Bora. Bora tomorrow. Our private jet is booked." She reached up from the mud, her manicured hands grasping desperately at Donovan's tailored trouser leg. She expected her wealthy, prominent groom to exercise his privilege to somehow banish the military presence and restore her perfect wedding aesthetic. She expected him to blindly defend her family, just as he had mocked me earlier in the day. But Donovan was currently experiencing a massive, terrifying reality check. He looked down at his weeping, mud-stained bride. He looked at the 200 heavily armed federal operatives surrounding them. He looked at his father, the four-star general, who had just threatened to completely disown him and strip him of his family name. Donovan realized with sudden, blinding clarity that standing next to Brittany meant standing next to a family of indicted federal criminals. It meant the total destruction of his own career, his trust fund, and his social standing. Self-preservation overrode every single ounce of loyalty he possessed. Donovan violently ripped his leg away from Brittany's grasp. He scrambled backward, looking at her as if she were covered in venom. He physically recoiled from the woman he had just promised to love and cherish for the rest of his life. "Are you crazy?" Donovan yelled, his voice cracking with panic and absolute disgust. He pointed a shaking finger at Richard, who was now weeping silently into his hands. "Your father just tried to defraud the U.S. military. He stole from the federal government. I am not getting on a plane to Bora Bora with the daughter of a traitor. We are done." The finality of Donovan's words hung in the humid air like a physical weight. He turned his back on the weeping bride and marched away, desperate to distance himself from the radioactive fallout of my family's crimes. Brittany screamed his name, her voice cracking in pure, pathetic desperation, but he did not even turn around. The high society guests, the local politicians, the corporate board members who had been sipping champagne just an hour ago were now actively backing away. They huddled together, whispering in terrified, hushed tones, realizing they were trapped inside a federal crime scene secured by 200 heavily armed operatives. Patricia watched her entire universe disintegrate in the span of 5 minutes. Her husband was about to be indicted for treason. Her golden child was abandoned at the altar. The social empire she had spent decades ruthlessly constructing was reduced to mud and crushed flower petals. And the architect of her destruction was the daughter she had banished to the shadows. Survival instinct overrode Patricia's massive ego. She realized with sudden, blinding clarity that the only person on this lawn with the power to stop the impending federal raid was me. The woman she had just shoved behind a floral arrangement was an active-duty rear admiral. Patricia dropped to the grass. She did not care about her expensive silk dress. She did not care about the mud soaking into her knees. She crawled forward, her diamond jewelry clattering against her chest, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Her mascara ran in dark streaks as she scrambled toward my polished black boots. "Diana, please," Patricia sobbed, clasping her trembling hands together in a pathetic display of submission. "You have to stop this. You have to tell the general it is a mistake. We are your family. We raised you. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood." I stood perfectly still. The brilliant morning sunlight reflected off the gold buttons of my pristine white uniform. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I searched my chest for a flicker of sympathy, a shred of daughterly affection, a hint of regret. I found absolutely nothing. Decades of emotional neglect and psychological warfare had burned away any bridge she could ever hope to cross. I kept my hands clasped behind my back in a rigid parade rest. My voice was calm, precise, and completely devoid of pity. "You raised me," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "That is a fascinating way to describe what you did to me." Patricia sniffled, looking up with a desperate, pleading expression, hoping her tears would manipulate my emotions the way they manipulated my father. "Please, Diana. We did everything for you. We gave you a home. You gave me an eviction notice." I corrected her sharply, my voice projecting across the silent courtyard. "Do you think I forgot the morning of my 18th birthday? You and Richard cornered me in the kitchen. You told me I was a useless burden because I refused to be a corporate puppet. But you did not just throw me out on the street. You robbed me first." Patricia flinched, her eyes darting nervously toward General Thomas, who was watching the exchange with absolute disgust. I stepped closer, forcing my mother to look at the medals on my chest. "You stole $150,000 from the trust fund Grandma left specifically for my education. You forged the withdrawal documents. You drained every single cent of my future so Brittany could have her dream life. You bought her a luxury sports car and a closet full of designer clothes while I slept in the freezing parking lot of a military recruitment center because you changed the locks on the front door." Brittany stopped crying for a fraction of a second, staring at her mother in shock. Even the golden child had not known the full extent of their financial crimes. "I did not survive because of you," I stated, my voice echoing with unyielding authority. "I survived in spite of you. You want to know who raised me?" I raised my right hand and gestured toward the 200 elite warriors standing in perfect rigid formation around the perimeter of the lawn. "The Navy raised me. The men standing in this room raised me. When I was starving, they fed me. When I was broken, they built me back up. We bled together in the dirt of hostile nations. We fought back to back in firefights you could not even comprehend in your worst nightmares. They are my family. You are just the woman who signed my birth certificate before trying to destroy my life." Patricia let out a strangled, breathless sob and collapsed entirely onto the ground, burying her face in her hands. She knew she was completely defeated. Her manipulation tactics were useless against a commander who had faced down enemy warlords. A few yards away, Richard realized his wife had failed. He saw General Thomas typing rapidly on an encrypted military tablet, actively communicating with federal authorities to initiate the warrants. He heard the distant approaching wail of police sirens echoing up the coastal highway. The FBI was coming. The illusion was dead. Richard was a coward who had spent his entire life paying other people to fight his battles, and now he had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Fight or flight kicked in, and Richard chose flight. He scrambled up from the mud, his ruined suit jacket flapping wildly. He locked his eyes onto the valet stand at the front entrance of the resort where his imported sports car was parked. If he could just reach the keys, if he could just get to his private airfield before the federal agents secured the perimeter, he could flee the country. He could use his remaining offshore accounts to vanish. Richard turned and bolted toward the exit, his expensive shoes tearing up the manicured grass as he made a desperate, pathetic dash for freedom. He did not even make it 10 feet. Two massive Navy SEALs standing like statues at the edge of the center aisle reacted with terrifying synchronized speed. They did not shout. They did not break a sweat. They simply pivoted on their heels, stepping flawlessly into Richard's path. In one fluid, practiced motion, they raised their tactical rifles and crossed the heavy metal barrels directly in front of his chest, forming an impenetrable, lethal barricade. Richard slammed into the crossed rifles, the impact knocking the wind completely out of his lungs. He stumbled backward, gasping for air, staring up at the two elite operators with wide, terrified eyes. "Sit down, civilian!" One of the SEALs growled his voice, a dark, menacing rumble that offered zero room for negotiation. Richard collapsed backward into the damp grass, his legs giving out completely. He stared up at the unyielding expressions of the Navy SEALs, his chest heaving, as the reality of his situation crushed the last ounce of defiance out of him. He was a man who had spent his entire life buying his way out of consequences, and now staring down the barrels of federal justice, his money was entirely worthless. Patricia remained curled on the ground a few feet away, her face buried in her hands, her desperate sobbing the only sound breaking the heavy silence of the courtyard. The absolute destruction of my parents was complete. Donovan stood frozen amidst the wreckage of his perfect high society wedding. He looked at Richard sitting in the mud, then at Patricia weeping hysterically, and finally at General Thomas, whose face radiated pure, unfiltered wrath. I watched the gears turning in Donovan's head. He was a creature of privilege, a man whose entire identity was wrapped in his trust fund, his country club memberships, and his pristine family name. He saw his future evaporating. He realized that remaining attached to Brittany meant anchoring himself to a sinking ship of federal indictments and public disgrace. The cowardice that defined his character took absolute control. Donovan violently brushed a speck of dirt off his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. He took a deliberate, highly visible step away from Brittany, putting physical distance between himself and my disgraced family. He squared his shoulders, attempting to project an image of righteous indignation for the benefit of his father and the watching crowd. He raised his voice, ensuring that every single guest and military operative could hear his betrayal. "I am done!" Donovan announced, his voice ringing out across the manicured lawn. He glared down at Brittany with an expression of profound disgust. "The wedding is off. I refuse to be associated with this level of corruption. I am not marrying into a family of felons." Brittany stopped crying instantly. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face freezing in a mask of absolute shock. For her entire life, her beauty and manipulation had guaranteed her a soft landing. She expected Donovan to swoop in to protect her, to use his wealth to shield her from the consequences of her family's crimes. Instead, he was publicly discarding her like trash. The shock evaporated, replaced by a feral, unhinged rage. The carefully crafted persona of the delicate, blushing bride completely disintegrated. Brittany scrambled up from the mud. Her custom silk gown, which cost more than most people made in a year, was stained brown and green, the delicate lace ripped from her frantic movements. She lunged forward with a guttural scream and hurled herself directly at Donovan. She slammed her fists into his chest, her manicured nails clawing at his expensive tuxedo. Donovan stumbled backward, throwing his arms up to protect his face as his former bride attacked him with the ferocity of a cornered animal. "You cannot do this to me!" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking as she pummeled his shoulders. "You promised me millions! You promised me status!" She did not scream about love. She did not scream about a broken heart or a lost future together. In her moment of ultimate panic, the ugly truth poured out of her. She only cared about the wealth. She only cared about the elite social standing his family name provided. Her fists hammered against him as she wailed, furious that her golden ticket was walking away. Donovan frantically grabbed her wrists, struggling to push her away, looking entirely pathetic as he wrestled with the screaming woman in the mud. I shifted my gaze to the audience. The prominent billionaires, local politicians, and high society influencers were not rushing to intervene. They were not offering words of comfort or trying to de-escalate the brawl. Instead, a sea of glowing screens illuminated the crowd. Dozens of elite guests had pulled out their smartphones. Camera flashes strobed against the gray morning light. Red recording dots blinked steadily. The very people Brittany had spent her entire life trying to impress were now actively filming her spectacular downfall. They were capturing her rolling in the mud, attacking her groom, and screaming about money. This footage would be circulating through every exclusive country club and boardroom by noon. It was not just a legal destruction, it was a total irreversible social execution. Brittany was becoming a viral spectacle of high society trash. I stood there watching, a silent observer of the chaos they brought upon themselves. With a final desperate shove, Donovan pushed Brittany away. She slipped on the wet grass and fell hard onto her back, her ruined dress tangling around her legs. Donovan stood panting, his tuxedo torn, his hair disheveled. He adjusted his collar, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. He turned his back on the weeping woman on the ground and looked directly at General Thomas. Donovan's chest puffed out slightly. He expected validation. He expected his four-star general father to praise him for cutting ties with the criminals and preserving the family honor. He believed his swift betrayal had saved him from the inferno. General Thomas did not blink. He did not offer a comforting smile or a nod of approval. He looked at his son with an expression so cold it could have frozen the ocean. The general stepped forward, towering over Donovan, his massive frame blocking out the sun. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register that carried absolute terrifying authority. "Don't think you're safe, son," General Thomas stated, his words hitting Donovan like a physical strike. "Diana's audit showed you helped Richard hide the money in your finance firm. You're going down with them." Donovan's mouth opened and closed silently like a suffocating fish hauled out of the ocean. He stared at the four-star general, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. He had spent his entire life assuming his father's rank and influence were a permanent shield, an invisible force field that permitted him to act with total impunity. He truly believed that even if he dipped his hands into Richard's dirty money, his father would cover it up to protect the family legacy. General Thomas did not operate on nepotism. He operated on absolute duty. But Dad Donovan finally stammered, his voice reduced to a pathetic squeak. "I did not know where the money came from. I was just managing the portfolios. You cannot let them arrest me." General Thomas signaled to two grim-faced federal agents waiting at the edge of the tactical perimeter. "Save it for the federal prosecutor, Donovan. You disgraced this uniform. You disgraced our name." General Thomas turned his back on his only son without a single ounce of hesitation. "Take him away." The federal agents moved in, slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto Donovan's wrists right over his custom-tailored tuxedo cuffs. The metallic click echoed sharply. Donovan began to weep, his knees buckling as the agents hauled him away from the altar, dragging him past the terrified audience. The sight of the wealthy, untouchable groom being carted off in irons broke the final dam of social restraint. The venue descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The 200 elite wedding guests, a collection of the most powerful billionaires, politicians, and socialites in the state, entirely abandoned their refined decorum. Panic ripped through the crowd. They realized that federal agents were actively securing a crime scene, and nobody wanted their face captured on a federal warrant sweep. The stampede was instantaneous and brutal. Women in silk designer gowns tripped over their stiletto heels, shoving each other out of the way to reach the gravel pathways. Men in expensive suits pushed past elderly guests, sprinting blindly toward the valet stand, screaming for their cars. The pristine, multi-million-dollar aesthetic of the wedding evaporated into a scene of utter destruction. The towering floral arches woven with thousands of imported white roses swayed and collapsed as panicked guests crashed through them, trampling the delicate blooms into the muddy earth. The hired string quartet had fled minutes ago, leaving an overturned cello and scattered sheet music blowing across the grass. At the grand reception tent behind the altar, the illusion of luxury completely died. The elite catering staff witnessing the CEO, who hired them, being placed under military guard, realized immediately that their massive paychecks were tied to frozen offshore accounts. They stopped serving. Waiters in crisp white aprons dropped heavy silver trays of crystal champagne flutes directly onto the cobblestones. The glass shattered, mixing with spilled champagne and mud. The staff simply untied their aprons, threw them on the ground, and walked away from the wreckage. In the epicenter of this total collapse, my biological family was finally experiencing the reality they had spent decades avoiding. Richard was hyperventilating on the wet grass. The corporate shark who had ruthlessly crushed competitors and stolen from the military was having a severe, uncontrollable panic attack. He clutched desperately at his chest, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he gasped for oxygen that his lungs refused to process. He was a broken, pathetic shell of a man drowning in the realization that he would spend his final decades locked inside a concrete federal cell. Patricia was in no position to help him. She was kneeling in the dirt beside him, sobbing with such violent intensity that her body physically shook. Her carefully constructed high society mask had melted entirely. Her expensive waterproof makeup was ruined, leaving ugly dark tracks smeared across her cheeks and neck. She clawed at the mud, mourning the death of her social empire, wailing loudly as she watched her billionaire friends trample each other to escape her presence. A few feet away, Brittany sat paralyzed in the ruined remnants of her custom wedding dress. The silk was torn and caked in dark mud. She did not scream anymore. She did not cry. She simply stared blankly at the collapsed floral altar, her mind entirely broken by the sheer speed at which her guaranteed life of endless luxury had been snatched away. She had lost her millionaire groom, her trust fund, and her entire future in less than 10 minutes. I stood perfectly still, a lone pillar of absolute calm amidst the hurricane of their destruction. I did not scream at them. I did not gloat. I did not need to hurl insults or demand apologies. The universe had just delivered the most brutal, comprehensive justice imaginable, and I was simply there to witness the final receipt being handed over. I looked down at the three strangers weeping in the mud. They were nothing to me now. Not parents, not a sister, just an assignment that had been successfully completed and neutralized. I raised my white-gloved hands and calmly adjusted my cover. I settled the crisp white navy hat perfectly over my brow, ensuring the gold insignia caught the morning light. I looked directly into Richard's panicked, bloodshot eyes. "You told me to take an Uber, Dad?" I stated, my voice slicing through the sounds of the fleeing crowd with effortless, icy precision. "But I think I prefer my own ride." I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them forever. I looked toward the 200 elite warriors holding the perimeter and gave a single sharp, tactical hand signal. "Let's go home, boys," I commanded. The response was instantaneous. 200 heavily armed Navy SEALs snapped to attention with a deafening synchronized crack of combat boots. They fell into a flawless, impenetrable formation directly behind me, moving as a single lethal organism. We marched away from the ruins of the wedding, our boots crunching in perfect unison against the gravel. Over the tree line, the heavy, rhythmic thud of massive rotor blades suddenly shook the air. The wind whipped violently through the trees as a sleek black military helicopter descended from the clouds, touching down just beyond the resort gates to extract its commander. I walked toward the waiting Blackhawk, leaving my former family behind in the mud and the ashes of the empire they had stolen. The absolute finality of General Thomas's declaration struck Donovan with the force of a physical blow. The wealthy heir stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping in the mud, as the realization of his own impending federal indictment completely shattered his reality. He was no longer the golden groom of a high society dynasty. He was a co-conspirator in a massive military fraud operation. General Thomas did not operate on nepotism. He operated on absolute duty. Donovan collapsed onto his knees beside Brittany, the two of them now united not in holy matrimony, but in total inescapable disgrace. The elite venue, which had cost millions of dollars to perfectly curate, descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The 200 wealthy wedding guests, a collection of the most powerful billionaires, politicians, and socialites in the state, entirely abandoned their refined decorum. Panic ripped through the crowd like a shockwave. They realized that federal agents and elite military operatives were actively securing a major crime scene, and absolutely nobody wanted their face captured on a federal warrant sweep. The stampede was instantaneous and brutal. Women in silk designer gowns tripped over their own stiletto heels, shoving each other out of the way to reach the gravel exit pathways. Men in custom-tailored suits pushed past elderly guests, sprinting blindly toward the valet stand, screaming at the terrified attendants for their luxury vehicles. The pristine aesthetic of the wedding evaporated into a scene of utter destruction. The towering floral arches, woven with thousands of imported white roses and orchids, swayed and collapsed as panicked guests crashed through them, trampling the delicate blooms into the dark, wet earth. At the grand reception tent behind the altar, the illusion of luxury completely died. The elite catering staff, witnessing the billionaire CEO who hired them being placed under military guard, realized immediately that their massive paychecks were tied to frozen offshore accounts. They stopped serving instantly. Waiters in crisp white aprons dropped heavy silver trays of crystal champagne flutes directly onto the cobblestones. The glass shattered, mixing with spilled champagne and mud in a sparkling, tragic mess. The staff simply untied their aprons, threw them on the ground, and walked away from the wreckage, leaving the decadent feast to rot in the humid air. In the epicenter of this total collapse, my biological family was finally experiencing the brutal reality they had spent decades avoiding. Richard was hyperventilating on the wet grass. The corporate shark who had ruthlessly crushed competitors and stolen from the military was having a severe, uncontrollable panic attack. He clutched desperately at his chest, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he gasped for oxygen that his lungs simply refused to process. He was a broken, pathetic shell of a man drowning in the sudden realization that his immense wealth could not buy his way out of federal treason charges. He would spend his final decades locked inside a concrete cell, stripped of his power, his dignity, and his name. Patricia was in no position to offer him any comfort. She was kneeling in the dirt beside him, sobbing with such violent intensity that her body physically shook. Her carefully constructed high society mask had melted entirely. Her expensive waterproof makeup was completely ruined, leaving ugly, dark tracks smeared across her cheeks and neck. She clawed at the mud, mourning the permanent death of her social empire. She wailed loudly as she watched her billionaire friends trample each other to escape her presence. Her social standing was her entire identity, and it had just been surgically excised in front of the entire world. A few feet away, Brittany sat paralyzed in the ruined remnants of her custom wedding dress. The silk was torn and caked in dark mud. She did not scream anymore. She did not cry. She simply stared blankly at the collapsed floral altar, her mind entirely broken by the sheer speed at which her guaranteed life of endless luxury had been snatched away. I stood perfectly still, a lone pillar of absolute calm amidst the hurricane of their destruction. I did not scream at them. I did not gloat. I did not need to hurl insults or demand apologies. The universe had just delivered the most brutal, comprehensive justice imaginable, and I was simply there to witness the final receipt being handed over. I looked down at the weeping figures in the mud. They were nothing to me now. Not parents, not a sister, not a brother-in-law, just a neutralized threat. I raised my white-gloved hands and calmly adjusted my cover. I settled the crisp white navy hat perfectly over my brow, ensuring the gold insignia caught the morning light. I took one deliberate step toward Richard. He flinched, his bloodshot eyes darting up to mine, terrified of what I might do next. "You told me to take an Uber, Dad," I stated. My voice was quiet, yet it sliced through the sounds of the fleeing crowd and the sobbing family with effortless, icy precision. But I think I prefer my own ride. I did not wait for a response. I did not look at Patricia's ruined face or Brittany's shattered expression. I turned my back on them forever. It was a definitive, permanent severance. I looked toward the elite warriors holding the perimeter and gave a single sharp tactical hand signal. "Let's go home, boys," I commanded. The response was instantaneous. 200 heavily armed Navy SEALs snapped to attention with a deafening, synchronized crack of combat boots. They fell into a flawless, impenetrable formation directly behind me, moving as a single lethal organism. We marched away from the ruins of the wedding, our boots crunching in perfect unison against the gravel, leaving the felons to the waiting federal agents. Over the tree line, the heavy rhythmic thud of massive rotor blades suddenly shook the air. The wind whipped violently through the trees as a sleek black military Black Hawk helicopter descended from the clouds. It touched down just beyond the resort gates, the immense downdraft tearing apart the last remaining wedding tents and scattering the debris across the lawn. I walked straight toward the waiting aircraft, the loading ramp dropping open to receive me. I stepped aboard the heavy doors sealing shut, leaving my former family behind in the mud and the ashes of the empire they had built on lies. I did not answer the phone. I let it ring. Let them feel the crushing silence of an unanswered plea, just as I had felt it 100 times before. Instead, I reached for the television remote sitting on my desk. I flicked the large flat screen mounted on the wall to a major national news network. I didn't need to search for the story. It was the only thing broadcasting. The words "breaking news" blared across the bottom of the screen in bright red letters. The headline read, "Corporate Treason, Billionaire Defense Contractor Indicted in Massive Pentagon Fraud." The news anchor, a stern-faced woman with perfectly coiffed hair, was actively tearing my family apart on national television. "Details are still emerging," the anchor stated gravely, "but federal authorities have confirmed a sweeping indictment against Richard, CEO of a major East Coast logistics empire. Sources within the Department of Defense allege that his company has been systematically falsifying safety records for military transport armor and embezzling hundreds of millions in federal funds into offshore shell accounts." The broadcast cut to raw, shaky helicopter footage. The aerial camera zoomed in on Richard's sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. A fleet of black FBI tactical vehicles was parked aggressively across the manicured lawn and the sweeping circular driveway. Dozens of federal agents in windbreakers were storming the property, carrying out boxes of physical evidence and seizing hard drives. Then the ground-level footage played. The camera shook slightly as paparazzi and local news crews swarmed the front gates of the mansion. Richard was being led out of his own front door in handcuffs. The arrogant, untouchable titan of industry who had commanded rooms and crushed competitors was completely broken. He wore a rumpled undershirt and sweatpants, his face pale and slack with shock. He looked small. He looked utterly terrified as federal agents shoved him into the back of an armored SUV. He tried to hide his face from the blinding camera flashes, but there was nowhere to hide. His total, absolute disgrace was being broadcast to millions. But the most pathetic spectacle was unfolding just behind him. The camera caught Brittany standing on the front steps of the mansion. The former golden child, the woman who had demanded I hide my military uniform so I wouldn't ruin her aesthetic, was having a total public meltdown. She was wearing designer silk pajamas, her hair an unbrushed, chaotic mess. She was shrieking at the paparazzi, her face contorted with a vicious, unhinged rage. "Leave us alone!" Brittany screamed, flailing her arms as federal agents pushed past her, carrying boxes of seized assets. "You can't do this. Do you know who we are? We are rich. You are ruining my life." The camera zoomed in tight on her desperate, screeching face, broadcasting her profound, sickening entitlement to the entire country. She looked like a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum over a broken toy, completely oblivious to the fact that her father had endangered American soldiers to pay for her luxury lifestyle. The internet was going to eviscerate her. She was already becoming the new face of corrupt, out-of-touch, toxic wealth. The broadcast cut back to the news desk. The anchor's expression grew even more serious. "The fallout from this military fraud case is rapidly expanding." The anchor continued. "Just an hour ago, federal regulators acting in coordination with the FBI executed a simultaneous raid on the downtown finance firm operated by Donovan." A new set of images flashed on the screen. It showed federal agents carrying computers out of a sleek glass-fronted skyscraper in the financial district. Authorities alleged that Donovan's firm acted as the primary financial laundromat for Richard's embezzled federal funds, the anchor reported. The firm's assets have been completely frozen, and Donovan is currently in federal custody awaiting arraignment. Analysts are calling this one of the swiftest and most comprehensive corporate takedowns in recent history. I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my black coffee. The dark roast was strong and bitter, a grounding sensation amidst the absolute destruction playing out on the screen. The entire corrupt network my family had built, the wealth they used to bludgeon me, the status they used to mock me, the corporate empire they believed made them untouchable gods, had been evaporated in less than 24 hours. It had taken a single encrypted flash drive and the unwavering discipline of the United States military to dismantle a lifetime of lies. They had built a fortress of sand, and I had simply let the tide roll in. My office door opened with a soft click. Commander Harris, a seasoned intelligence officer who had served on multiple deployments with me, stepped into the room. He held a classified briefing folder under his arm. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes moving from my face to the television screen, watching the footage of Brittany shrieking at the paparazzi. Harris let out a low whistle, crossing his arms over his chest. He had seen the audit. He knew exactly what had transpired at the wedding yesterday. He knew the people on the screen were my biological family. "That is a brutal takedown," Admiral Harris said quietly, his voice respectful but filled with a distinct, undeniable curiosity. He looked back at me, studying my calm, unbothered expression. "Do you feel bad for them?" Admiral Harris asked. I paused, looking at the television screen. The broadcast had switched back to the footage of Richard being shoved into the federal SUV in handcuffs. He looked directly at the camera for a split second, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate pleading. He looked like a man begging for someone to save him from the consequences of his own horrific greed. I stared at his face, searching my chest for a flicker of regret, a tiny shred of daughterly sorrow, or even a hint of guilt. I found absolutely nothing. The well was entirely dry. They had burned the bridge, salted the earth, and danced on the ashes. They had demanded I take an Uber from the airport while they spent stolen military funds on imported champagne. They had told me I was a failure because I chose to serve my country instead of serving their ego. I turned away from the screen and looked directly at Commander Harris. "No," I stated, my voice steady, precise, and completely devoid of emotion. "I feel nothing at all." Commander Harris held my gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between us in the secure Pentagon office. He gave a slow, understanding nod, stepping back from the doorway to clear my path. He had read my personnel file. He knew the bare clinical facts of my estrangement from Richard and Patricia, but seeing the absolute emotional void in my eyes cemented the reality for him. I reached for the television remote and clicked the power button instantly, severing the frantic, breathless commentary of the news anchors. The screen went black, plunging my office back into a state of disciplined silence. I gathered my pristine white uniform jacket from the back of my leather chair, shrugging it on and meticulously adjusting my collar to ensure the fit was flawless. I walked past Commander Harris, offering a brief professional nod of dismissal, and navigated the labyrinthine, highly secured corridors of the Pentagon. The drive across the Potomac River was quiet. The mid-morning sun reflected blindingly off the water, casting sharp, brilliant glares across the windshield of my government-issued SUV. On the radio, every local and national news station was leading with the spectacular, explosive downfall of Richard's corporate empire. The pundits were already actively analyzing the ripple effects on the national defense sector, marveling at the sheer scale of the embezzlement, and loudly predicting the inevitable lengthy federal prison sentences awaiting my biological parents. I reached over and twisted the volume dial to 0. I had spent enough of my life listening to their names. I parked just outside the main gates of Arlington National Cemetery, retrieving a modest bouquet of white hydrangeas from the passenger seat. The contrast between the chaotic, muddy, screaming disaster of the country club wedding and the pristine, silent acres of Arlington was absolute. Row upon row of perfectly aligned white marble headstones stretched out across the rolling green hills, standing like silent sentinels under the bright sky. This was a place of supreme order built entirely on the foundation of ultimate sacrifice. I walked with measured, deliberate steps along the paved pathways, the only sound the steady rhythmic crunch of my polished black boots against the pavement. I bypassed the prominent sections reserved for high-ranking flag officers and famous historical figures. Instead, I navigated the winding paths until I reached Section 60, a quiet, solemn expanse shaded by massive ancient oak trees. I stopped in front of 3 specific headstones grouped closely together in the manicured grass. Chief Petty Officer Miller, Lieutenant Vance, Special Operator Hayes. I knelt slowly, carefully dividing the white hydrangeas and placing a few fresh stems at the base of each marble marker. The sharp, clean scent of cut stems and damp earth filled the cool morning air. As I looked at their engraved names, the memory of my 18th birthday hit me, not with the familiar sting of trauma, but with the brilliant clarity of profound gratitude. When my parents had cornered me in the kitchen, illegally stripped my trust fund, and literally locked me out of my childhood home, I had nowhere to go. I had slept on the freezing concrete of a local military recruitment center parking lot, shivering under a thin denim jacket, my stomach twisting violently with hunger. It was Chief Miller who had found me the next morning. He had not looked at me with the thinly veiled disgust or crushing disappointment that my parents always wore. He had bought me a hot breakfast, handed me a pen, and told me that if I had the sheer grit to survive a freezing night on concrete, I had the grit to become a sailor. Lieutenant Vance had been my very first commanding officer. When I showed up to my first duty station with nothing but a sea bag and a fierce, angry chip on my shoulder, she had pulled me directly into her office. She did not coddle me. She tore away my defensive walls with brutal, necessary honesty, teaching me exactly how to channel my raw rage into tactical, calculated precision. She taught me how to truly lead. She taught me how to read a battlefield in a boardroom with the exact same lethal calculation. And Hayes. Hayes had been my squad mate during my first overseas combat deployment. We had shared meager rations in the blistering, relentless heat of the desert. We had covered each other's blind spots during chaotic, terrifying firefights. When a piece of shrapnel tore through my shoulder during an ambush, Hayes had physically dragged me through the dirt to the medevac helicopter, absolutely refusing to let go of my tactical harness until I was safely aboard. He died 2 years later on a covert extraction mission, leaving behind a legacy of absolute, unshakable loyalty. I reached out and touched the top of Hayes's headstone, the white marble warm beneath my fingertips. My biological mother and father had always furiously insisted that blood was the only valid metric of family. They used the concept of family as a blunt weapon, a transactional contract designed to demand blind obedience and aggressively punish any sign of independence. They believed that sharing a last name gave them the inherent right to humiliate me, steal from me, and cast me aside the moment I refused to be their corporate puppet. Looking at the graves of the men and women who had actually raised me, I realized with absolute unwavering certainty how pathetic my parents' definition of family truly was. Blood did not make a family. Blood was simply a biological accident. True family was forged in the extreme fire of shared hardship. It was defined by unwavering loyalty, by mutual respect, and by the willingness to sacrifice your own comfort for the survival of the person standing next to you. My real family did not live in a multi-million-dollar mansion in the suburbs. My real family was buried in the cemetery, and their legacy lived on in the white uniform I wore every single day. I had not lost my family this weekend. I had simply taken out the garbage. I stood up, brushing a single blade of grass from the knee of my trousers. I snapped a crisp textbook salute to the 3 headstones holding the rigid position for a long, silent minute to honor the people who had actually saved my life. The deep, solemn silence of the cemetery was suddenly pierced by the sharp, encrypted ringtone of my secure government mobile device. I dropped my salute, reaching into my inner jacket pocket, and pulled out the heavy black phone. The screen displayed a direct top-tier clearance code. I pressed the secure connection button and raised the device to my ear. "Admiral speaking. I answered, my voice steady and completely focused. Admiral, the Secretary of Defense's voice came through the encrypted line, carrying a tone of absolute urgency and high command. The President is ready for you in the Oval Office. It is time for your pinning ceremony. I am on my way, Mr. Secretary, I replied, my voice steady and completely unwavering. I terminated the encrypted connection, sliding the heavy black device back into the inner pocket of my crisp white jacket. I took one last long look at the pristine marble headstones of the mentors who had forged me into a warrior. I gave a final silent nod of profound gratitude, turned on my heel, and marched away from the quiet serenity of Arlington National Cemetery. At that exact moment, miles away from the hallowed, honorable grounds of the nation's fallen heroes, the brutal, grinding machinery of federal justice was actively crushing my former family into dust. Inside the United States District Court, the atmosphere was freezing, clinical, and completely devoid of mercy. The harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights reflected off the polished linoleum floor, illuminating a scene of absolute spectacular ruin. Richard and Donovan, the two men who had spent their entire lives believing their immense wealth elevated them above the law, were currently stripped of every single ounce of their arrogant power. They were no longer wearing their bespoke, custom-tailored Italian silk suits. Instead, they were drowning in the stiff, scratchy neon orange fabric of standard-issue federal prison jumpsuits. Heavy steel chains bound their wrists and their ankles. Every time Donovan shifted his weight, terrified out of his mind, the thick metal links rattled loudly, echoing off the high ceiling of the courtroom. The sound was a stark, undeniable confirmation of their new reality. Donovan was openly weeping, his face pale and slick with a terrified sweat, his previous aristocratic smirk entirely erased. Richard stared straight ahead, his jaw locked in a rigid, horrified grimace. He was watching the federal prosecutor stack literal mountains of digital evidence onto the oak table. The sheer volume of the seized data was insurmountable. The financial forensic teams had completely decrypted their offshore shell networks, specifically citing irrefutable electronic ledgers recovered during the raid, including heavily encrypted files logged as duyenmao1 underscore 25.docx, duyenmao 2 underscore 25.docx, duyenmao 3 underscore 25.docx, and duyenmao 4 underscore 25.docx. These specific files contained the exact blueprints of their massive military embezzlement scheme. Richard looked back over his shoulder toward the public gallery, desperately searching for a friendly face, a bribed politician, or a high-priced defense attorney ready to pull a miracle. He found absolutely no one. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with aggressive journalists, sketch artists, and stern federal regulators. His billionaire friends had vanished the absolute second the FBI tactical teams breached his estate. He was entirely, devastatingly alone, facing decades behind solid steel bars. Simultaneously, on the outskirts of the city, a different kind of brutal reality was unfolding. The heavy, freezing rain poured relentlessly from a slate-gray sky, hammering against the cracked asphalt of a cheap roadside motel parking lot. The flickering, buzzing neon sign above the main office sputtered violently, casting a sickly pink glow over the dreary scene. Patricia and Brittany, the former queens of high society, who had demanded absolute perfection and endless luxury, were currently experiencing the total collapse of their social empire. They did not have their designer Louis Vuitton luggage. All of their luxury assets, their imported cars, their offshore bank accounts, and their sprawling estate had been instantly frozen and seized by the federal government under the RICO Act. Instead, Patricia and Brittany were dragging heavy black plastic garbage bags through the muddy, oil-stained puddles of the parking lot. The bags were stuffed haphazardly with whatever random clothes they had managed to frantically grab before the federal agents physically locked them out of the mansion. Brittany's expensive, custom-styled hair was plastered to her skull by the freezing rain. Her designer shoes were completely ruined, soaked in dark, gritty mud. She was screaming hysterically at her mother, her voice shrill and unhinged, blaming Patricia for the lack of a backup plan, blaming Richard for getting caught, and blaming the universe for stripping her of her gold-plated pedestal. Patricia did not have the energy to yell back. Her meticulously maintained Botoxed face was sagging with sheer exhaustion and total despair. She struggled with the rusted metal keycard reader on the peeling door of room 114, her manicured nails chipping and breaking against the cheap plastic. They were entirely stripped of their social armor, reduced to fighting each other in the pouring rain outside a roach-infested motel. It was the absolute bottom of the barrel, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. A stark, brilliant contrast awaited me at the center of the free world. The heavy, solid mahogany doors of the Oval Office swung open seamlessly. The space was bathed in a rich, warm, golden light steeped in centuries of history and undeniable ultimate authority. The air in the room was charged with a profound electric respect. I stepped across the threshold, my posture impeccably straight, my chin held high. The pristine, immaculate white fabric of my navy dress uniform caught the bright light, every single metal ribbon and gold button, aligned with flawless, calculated perfection. A massive pool of White House press correspondents and military photographers was gathered along the perimeter of the room. The absolute second I stepped onto the iconic oval rug, a blinding, chaotic cascade of flashbulbs erupted, lighting up the room like a localized thunderstorm. The cameras documented every single step of my triumphant arrival. General Thomas stood waiting for me just to the right of the resolute desk. The hardened legendary commander looked at me with an expression of immense, unwavering pride. He gave me a sharp, respectful nod, acknowledging the brutal, arduous journey I had undertaken to reach this exact moment. He stepped into position just behind my right shoulder, standing as the ultimate symbol of the true, loyal military family that had recognized my worth when my biological family had discarded me. The President of the United States stepped forward from behind his desk. His expression was grave, respectful, and filled with deep admiration. He held a small, velvet-lined wooden box in his hands. The room fell into an absolute breathless silence as he addressed the gathered press and military brass. He spoke with deep, echoing authority about my unparalleled service to the nation. He detailed my tactical brilliance, my unwavering integrity, and the sheer, unbreakable courage required to expose and completely dismantle the largest defense fraud network of the decade. He made it crystal clear to the entire world that I had not just protected military assets, but that I had actively saved American lives by excising a cancerous, corrupt rot from the defense supply chain. The president stepped directly in front of me, opening the velvet box to reveal the heavy, gleaming gold shoulder boards. With careful, deliberate precision, he pinned the brilliant stars of a rear admiral onto my shoulders. The physical weight of the gold pressed down on my uniform, a heavy, magnificent culmination of a lifetime of grueling sacrifice, relentless discipline, and absolute honor. I took a sharp half-step back, my body moving with rigorous military precision. I raised my white-gloved hand and snapped a flawless, razor-sharp salute to the commander-in-chief. The president returned the salute immediately, his eyes locking onto mine with deep, silent respect. As I held that salute bathed in the flashbulbs and the golden light of the Oval Office, the final undeniable truth settled deeply into my bones. They told me I was a failure because I didn't fit into their shallow, corrupt world. They were right. I didn't fit in, because eagles don't belong in a cage full of rats. I dropped my salute with a crisp, definitive snap. I turned on my heel, the press pool immediately parting like the sea to clear a wide, respectful path for me. I walked out of the Oval Office, my heavy black boots echoing with authority against the marble floors of the colonnade. I pushed open the exterior doors and stepped out into the bright, brilliant, blinding sunlight. I was completely victorious, absolutely powerful, and for the first time in my entire life, I was completely and utterly free. The most profound lesson from these stories of betrayal is that your true worth is never defined by those who underestimate you. Whether facing a stolen inheritance, a public humiliation, or enduring a medical crisis alone, the protagonists realized that blood ties do not guarantee unconditional love. Instead, genuine security comes from cultivating your own independence and surrounding yourself with a chosen family who respects you authentically. When toxic relatives try to break your spirit, your greatest revenge is simply thriving on your own terms. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family to find your true worth? Share your story in the comments below.